Hey guys, tonight we're slipping past velvet drapes and whispering candlelight into a world where every glance, touch and phrase meant something. Where courtesans ruled not just beds but banquets, and where the real education didn't come from books. You're about to float through powdered parlours and secret salons, places where people paid fortunes for things they couldn't admit to wanting. Fair warning, you probably won't survive this if you're expecting a romantic comedy. This is the 1600s, baby. Diseases are rampant, marriages are political, and intimacy is practically weaponized. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, what city are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in a room that smells faintly of beeswax and crushed rose petals. It's past midnight, and the world outside is dead quiet except for a few creaking wagons rolling through cobblestone streets. But inside, it's warm and humming. You're sitting on the edge of a low bed draped in silk, watching a woman in a layered robe stir something into a goblet. Maybe wine, maybe something stronger. She's not the kind of woman you marry. She's the one your tutor warned you about, the kind whose letters you'd burn after reading but never forget. This is not a brothel. This is something else. A private apartment above a jeweller's shop in a neighbourhood with no signs. Only those who knew how to find her ever did. She doesn't speak right away. Courtesans rarely start with words. Instead, she watches you like she's trying to read everything you've ever done, or wanted to do. Her perfume is musky and strange, almost like amber and sweat, and there's a knife on the table near the candlesticks. Not hidden, but not threatening either, just part of the decor. Back in the 1600s, being a courtesan wasn't just about sex. It was about control, of rooms, of power, of knowledge. These women were trained in the same arts as diplomats. Their minds were as sharp as their wardrobes. A real courtesan knew how to flatter a duke, quotes Seneca, feign jealousy just enough to get a new necklace, and still have the upper hand by sunrise. You think you're here for her body, but she knows your finances, your rivals, and your weak spots or weak spots better than your accountant does. Here's the thing most people forget. In a time when women weren't even allowed to speak in courtrooms, courtesans carved out their own form of influence. Not officially, of course, but unofficially. If the Count of so-and-so was funding a war, chances are someone like her whispered something about it into his ear the night before. In private salons all over Europe, politics and pillow talk were more entangled than lace and corset stairs. And yes, the sex was good, transcendent even, but only because she made it that way. It wasn't about acrobatics or some secret Kama Sutra position smuggled in from the East. It was about being seen in a way no one else bothered to see you. She made you feel like the centre of the universe for one night, and then sent you home feeling like a king, even if you were barely a clerk. A quirky fact for you, some courtesans trained with stage actors to perfect their expressions. In Venice, there were even manuals passed around, handwritten, of course, teaching how to laugh without wrinkling your face, how to sigh like you'd just tasted paradise, and how to cry just enough that a man would forgive his own guilt for loving you. Courtesans were emotional illusionists, and their power wasn't in their bodies, it was in the stories they could tell with their bodies. But let's not romanticize this too much. The reality was brutal beneath the silk. Courtesans didn't get old gracefully. When youth faded, so did protection. The church called them sinners, society pretended not to know them, and their male patrons were quick to move on to younger toys. A lucky few saved enough to retire with a cottage and a dog. Others weren't so lucky, penniless, exiled, or quietly disposed of when they knew too much. It was a high-wire act, and every night was a gamble. Historians still debate whether courtesans really had as much power as we like to think. Sure, there were famous ones, Veronica Franco in Venice, Ninon de L'Enclos in France, who were written about, feared, even honoured. But were they exceptions, or proof of a larger invisible class? Did these women truly shape policy and culture, or did we just latch onto them as fantasies of feminine rebellion in a man's world? No one agrees. The archives are spotty, the records often rewritten, and many courtesans were brilliant at disappearing when they needed to. But you don't care about that right now. Right now you're still in that room watching her light a long-stemmed pipe and offer you a pull. Her nails are painted with something shimmery, fish scale powder maybe, and her voice is low, trained, almost hypnotic. She asks about your dreams, and not just the easy kind. the ones you don't tell anyone, and when you finally speak, she listens like your words matter. More than money, more than politics, it's terrifying and thrilling. Because that's what the courtesan was in the 1600s, a mirror, a muse, a master of human craving. She taught sex, yes, but only as part of a larger lesson about power, vulnerability, and how far someone might go to feel alive. You finish your drink. She asks if you want to stay the night. You probably do. You wake to the sound of water lapping just outside the window, soft, rhythmic, like a lazy heartbeat against stone. For a second, you forget where you are. Then you feel the silk beneath your back, the stale sweetness of incense clinging to your hair, and the faint ache in your thighs. It comes back in pieces, the wine, the stories, the weight of her gaze. You sit up slowly. She's already gone. Of course she is. A woman like that never sleeps beside anyone. Sleep is too honest. You shuffle to the window and look out. Gondolas drift through the early grey of morning. The Grand Canal gleams like spilled mercury, reflecting the pale sky and the tops of faded palazzi. This is Venice, city of masks, city of secrets, city of transactions done under the cover of moonlight. And here, in the 1600s, it's already legendary. Not for its churches or its paintings, though there are plenty of those. No, Venice has earned another name, the pleasure capital of Europe. See, the thing about Venice was that it made indulgence feel like art. Sex wasn't a sin here. It was practically a civic attraction. And courtesans? They were more than tolerated. They were stars. Visitors came not just to see the architecture, but to experience something they couldn't get back home. Something silkier, smarter, less shameful. The courtesans of Venice were refined, witty, and staggeringly expensive. Some were even officially registered by the state. Yes, registered, as in given licenses to practice their craft, complete with codes of dress and zones of operation. You walk the narrow alleyways now, your boots echoing on wet stone, and notice how the buildings lean toward each other like gossiping women. Venice was a city built on trade and shadows. Here, power was always slightly offstage, always draped in velvet, and the courtesans knew how to work it. They didn't stand on corners, they held salons, they hosted poetry readings, musical performances, and philosophical debates. One could recite Petrarch and pour wine without spilling a drop. Clients weren't just paying for pleasure, they were paying for the illusion of being seen by someone who understood all their contradictions. Here's a quirky little twist. The wealthiest courtesans often paid for their own gondoliers, recognisable by their custom uniforms. Imagine gliding through the canals in a boat more lavish than most people's homes, just to arrive at your tailor's shop or your favourite bakery. Courtesans were fashion icons. They dictated style more than queens did. Some even had signature colours, think crimson veils or emerald slippers, so that men could whisper about spotting them at a distance. One woman, reportedly, had a sapphire-encrusted eye patch, not because she'd lost an eye, but because she could. But it wasn't all satin and pearls. Venice could turn on you, quickly. A single rumour could cost a courtesan her entire client base, and once cast out, there was no coming back. Reputation was currency. Jealous wives, political enemies, or scorned lovers could end a career with a letter or a well-timed whisper. The state kept lists of honest courtesans and dishonest ones, the difference mostly who they upset. Historians argue whether Venice's openness about sex was progressive or just practical. Was it enlightenment, or simply a city using vice to fund virtue? After all, Venice had a reputation to uphold, a place where indulgence met elegance, where morality bent gracefully like a bowstring. Some scholars say the courtesans were empowered women, carving out independence in a male world. Others say they were just more elegantly trapped, objects of consumption who knew how to look like they weren't. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. As you wander farther, you find yourself in the quieter part of the city, away from the grand piazzas. Here the stone gets slicker, and the smell of the lagoon sharpens. You pass a doorway with a carving above it, 2 doves and a fig tree. You've seen it before. It's the old symbol for a pleasure house that catered to nobles too discreet for the main canals. Not a brothel exactly, more like a retreat. Inside, women rid fortunes, sang duets, painted skin with gold powder, and sometimes, if the price was right, shared themselves. One of these places was rumoured to keep a book, a literal guest ledger, that detailed what each client liked, feared and confessed after too much wine. It was said to be passed down between madams with notes in the margins and code names for royalty. Imagine being immortalised not for your public acts, but for your private fantasies, stored in ink, just 3 floors above a fishmonger's stall. You stop for coffee. Well, what passes for coffee in this century? Bitter, thick, and barely sweetened. Across from you, a woman in a high-collared gown watches the canal with disinterest. Her rings sparkle, but not as much as her silence. You can tell by her stillness that she's someone. Maybe not a courtesan, but something adjacent. She meets your eyes for a heartbeat too long, just enough to remind you that in Venice, looking is always part of the game. Later that night, you're invited, by pure accident or so it seems, to a small gathering in a private villa. Musicians are tuning lutes. The room smells of cloves and something darker. The host, a courtesan known only as La Damigella, makes an entrance in silver brocade and a collar so stiff it casts a shadow on the wall behind her. She doesn't smile. She doesn't have to. Every man stands a little straighter. Every woman watches with narrowed eyes. She speaks 5 languages. She's read Ovid and Machiavelli. She's allegedly seduced a Spanish ambassador and convinced him to abandon his post. Tonight she's reading a new poem, her own, of course, about drowning in desire and emerging crowned in seaweed. Everyone claps, but she doesn't look up. She's not performing for them. She's performing for herself. And you're just watching, barely breathing, realizing you're in the presence of someone who has made seduction into a fully formed identity. It's not a job, it's not even a persona, it's a philosophy. And you're beginning to understand just how little you knew about intimacy before stepping into this world. You've seen masks before, at masquerade balls, in dusty shop windows, or hanging like strange trophies in antique stores, but you've never really understood them until now. In Venice, in the 1600s, a mask is more than disguise. It's strategy, it's flirtation, it's a way to say everything while giving away nothing. And when it's worn by a courtesan, the mask becomes a kind of armour, painted with intent, framed in feathers or lace lined with secrets. Tonight you're attending a mask gathering, one of the less formal ones, hosted in a private palazzo by a minor noble who prefers anonymity and strong drink. The women glide like shadows. The men puff on perfumed tobacco and pretend they are not constantly checking for eye contact across the room. And there, leaning against a marble column, is her. The courtesan you met the night before, only this time she's layered in painted silks and face powder so white it glows under the lamplight. Her eyes peek out through a black velvet mask trimmed in gold. You know it's her, not because she acknowledges you, but because she doesn't. It's a game now. In this era, appearance isn't just decoration, it's declaration. The more artificial the face, the more dangerous the woman behind it. You step closer, watching how she raises her fan to hide a whisper, how her jewelled fingers emphasise every syllable. The colours of her gown shift with the light, moving from peacock blue to sea green. Her cheeks are blushed into near cartoon roundness, and her lips are stained with cochineal, a pigment made from crushed insects that was expensive enough to make even kings hesitate. And the scent? Not flowers, something spicier. Clove, ambergris, maybe a little myrrh. She smells like a foreign port in a locked drawer. In the 1600s, makeup isn't just for vanity, it's for survival. Courtesans paint their faces like armour. Heavy lead-based powders conceal blemishes, illnesses and age. Rouge is dabbed on with rabbit fur to simulate arousal or heartbreak depending on the performance. Eyebrows are plucked or reshaped entirely. Wigs, often powdered with flour or tinted blue-grey, add a final flourish. Extra height to signify status, or simply to distract from the real person beneath. It's easy to forget there's a human being underneath it all, but she hasn't forgotten. She's using it. Every detail is calibrated. The curl of the wig, the sheen of her lipstick, the tiny mole placed high on her cheek to draw your eye exactly where she wants it. Even the way she turns her head is a kind of choreography. You're not falling for her, you're falling for the version she wants you to want. Here's a strange, delightful fact. Some women wore fake beauty spots called mouches, tiny patches of velvet or silk glued to the face in different shapes and locations, each with its own coded meaning. A spot near the mouth meant flirtation, near the right cheek, passion, near the eye, mourning. Some women even cut them into hearts, stars or crescent moons, turning their faces into tiny maps of seduction. Courtesans, of course, mastered this language and bent it to their will. A woman could change her entire emotional presentation with a single dot. You find yourself wondering how much of her is performance and how much is real. But then again, isn't that the wrong question? In this world, performance is reality. Sincerity is just another colour on the palette. And the most dangerous courtesans are the ones who can sell both at the same time. But not everyone was charmed by their painted faces and calculated gazes. Critics, mostly men, mostly priests, called them witches, liars, disgraces. They wrote treatises claiming that painted women lured men into moral collapse, that their makeup poisoned minds as well as bodies. Some insisted that makeup was a form of demonic transformation, literally opening the wearer to possession. Others claimed it caused infertility, madness, even death. Was any of it true? Of course not, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was fear. Fear of women who knew how to control attention. Fear of being powerless in the presence of someone beautiful on purpose. There's still debate among scholars about how much autonomy courtesans really had. Some argue that beneath the painted surface many were just as trapped as the average housewife, only with better wallpaper and a more colourful clientele. Others insist they were the first real feminists, using the limited tools of their time to carve out space, power and legacy. One thing's for sure, they understood the currency of beauty better than anyone else alive. Later in the evening you watch as she removes one glove, slowly, fingers first, then holds out her hand to a bishop's son with too much cologne and not enough wit. He kisses her fingers like they're relics. She smiles without showing teeth, just enough to make him think he's winning. And you get it now. This isn't manipulation, this is negotiation. It's theatre, it's myth. And it's all happening under 4 inches of lead paint and a powdered wig. You wonder how long she has before the makeup cracks, before the city shifts, before someone younger and newer walks through the same marble doorway and starts the cycle all over again. You stay until the candles burn low and the guests drift out like ghosts. She's still there, still glowing, still masked. She gives you one final glance, not an invitation, not quite a dismissal either. Just a look that says, "You'll never really know me, but you'll remember me forever." You step into the night. The wind smells of seaweed and wine. Your face feels naked by comparison. And all you can think about is what's underneath the powder, and how much of it you'll never be allowed to see. You leave Venice behind. Not physically, not yet. But the city starts to dissolve in your mind like sugar in warm wine. It lingers, sweet and dangerous. The masks, the canals, the courtesans who smiled without ever smiling. But the next stop on this journey takes you inland to the powdered salons and gilded chambers of France. Specifically to the sprawling, glittering beast of Versailles, where seduction isn't an art, it's a national sport. You arrive during the golden age of Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King. Everything here is about display. Power is ornamental. Status is worn like armour, in the form of lace collars and heels so high they could double as scaffolding. But behind the pearls and powdered faces, something stranger is happening. The courtesan class in France isn't confined to Venetian-style salons or secret apartments. Here the lines blur. At Versailles, some women who begin as mistresses end up shaping history. Some who start in the shadows rise high enough to cast their own. The court is a strange kind of theatre, half politics, half pageantry. And if Venice taught you about pleasure as ritual, Versailles shows you pleasure as strategy. You watch a young woman, barely 20, twirl a fan as she leans into the ear of a marquis. The conversation lasts less than a minute. By morning, his allegiance in a minor land dispute will have shifted entirely. That's how fast the current moves here. Swift, silent, and beneath the surface. It wasn't just about sex, of course. Courtesans in Versailles were expected to be charming, literate, amusing, and, above all, useful. A clever mistress might relay gossip from another noble's bed. A skilled one could secure appointments, inherit estates, or protect entire families. One woman, Madame de Montespan, starts off as a witty lady-in-waiting and ends up the king's most infamous mistress, with enough influence to rival the queen. She gives him 7 children. 7. And still manages to host some of the most deliciously scandalous parties the court has ever known. But it's not all champagne and opera. Montespan's story takes a dark turn, as these things often do. Rumours surface, whispers of black masses, of powdered poisons slipped into chocolate, of babies sacrificed to demons to keep the king in her bed. It's called the Affair of the Poisons, and it wraps its sticky fingers around half the court before the dust settles. Whether she's guilty or just a convenient scapegoat, we'll never really know, but what's clear is this: at Versailles, desire can elevate you to divine heights, and suspicion can drop you straight into hell. You're standing in the Hall of Mirrors now. Sunlight pours through the windows and bounces off glass so clean it looks like water. Courtiers stroll by in silks and wigs, giggling behind their fans, their laughter as brittle as hard candy. Somewhere in the crowd you spot another courtesan. This one not yet a household name. She's listening, not speaking, letting the silence do her work. Her dress is less ornate than others, but her posture is flawless. Every inch of her body is saying, "You'll come to me when you're ready." This is where French courtesans truly shine. Not in the obvious seductions, but in the long games. The positioning, the way they plant seeds in conversations and let them bloom 3 weeks later in a different man's mouth. They aren't just reacting to power, they're engineering it. In a palace where every glance can make or break you, knowing exactly when to smile or not is a form of survival. Here's a delicious oddity. Versailles had secret passageways, hidden staircases, narrow tunnels, doors disguised as panelling. They weren't just for the king to sneak into a mistress's room, they were for the mistresses to escape, to avoid jealous rivals or angry wives, or guards sent to escort them out under less than polite circumstances. Some women knew the palace better than the architects. They walked its veins like blood, carrying secrets through its arteries in silk slippers. And there were rules, so many rules. Who could speak to whom? When you could sit, whether your lace was appropriate, and courtesans, they broke them subtly, beautifully. A flash of shoulder where none was permitted. A fabric so sheer it bordered on indecent, until a well-timed compliment from a duke made it fashionable. Every rule broken was a message. I am outside your system, and yet I thrive within it. Still, not all the seductions end well. You overhear a nobleman discussing a former favourite of the king, a girl who rose fast and fell even faster. She had wit, charm, a laugh like a crystal bell. But then came another, younger, blonder. Her name was barely dry on the list of royal guests before her apartments were reassigned and her jewels reclaimed. And just like that, she vanished. They say she moved to a convent, or maybe to Marseille, or maybe she threw herself into the Seine. No one knows and no one dares to ask. Historians argue whether Versailles' courtesans had any real power, or were just symbols of a decadent court rotting from the inside. Was their influence meaningful or just ornamental? Some argue they shaped everything from war strategy to fashion. Others say they were tolerated so long as they entertained. The truth is likely both, respected and resented, protected and exploited, visible and invisible. You wander into a salon just in time to hear a reading. A woman stands by the fireplace, her voice steady as she recites a new sonnet about longing and betrayal. Everyone listens, even the men who usually dismiss poetry as ladies' talk. She finishes. There's a beat of silence, then applause. A marquis mutters to his friend, "She'd make a terrible wife, but a perfect mistress." They laugh. She does not. Later, as night creeps across the gardens, you find yourself on a terrace, alone with a glass of chilled wine. The stars overhead are faint, but steady. Below, the palace glows from within like a lantern, and you realise that every window flickering in that vast facade hides a story. A secret. A seduction. Some have been written down. Most never will be. The courtesans of Versailles taught more than how to please. They taught how to listen, how to wait, how to make someone feel seen without ever showing your own face. And above all, they taught that power and desire are rarely separate, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who isn't supposed to be there at all. It's raining tonight, not a storm, not yet. Just a soft drizzle that makes the world feel like it's wrapped in gauze. You're sitting beside a small writing desk in a Parisian apartment. No grand palace this time, just a narrow room with wood-panelled walls, candlelight and the rustle of paper. She's writing, not to you, not yet. The courtesan you've been following, she has many names and none of them are real, is dipping her quill in ink that smells faintly of iron and lavender. And what she's writing isn't just flirtation, it's war by other means. In the 1600s, a well-written letter from a courtesan could undo a marriage, bankrupt a noble, or seal an alliance more binding than any treaty. These weren't love letters in the modern emoji-filled sense. They were strategic masterpieces, equal parts poetry, manipulation and performance. A courtesan might spend hours crafting a single phrase, weighing how much longing to show, how much distance to maintain, whether to include a perfume-soaked lock of hair or just let her ink do the seducing. You lean closer and read the first line. My thoughts wander to you not out of duty, but because my soul recognises yours as the safer cage. Oof! She's not pulling any punches tonight. Letters like these weren't just expressions of affection, they were tools of survival. A nobleman away at court needed to be reminded of what he left behind, and a courtesan needed him to remember her value. Intellectual, emotional, sensual. Every day he wasn't touching her skin. A single misplaced word could cost her a week's allowance or signal to a rival that the door was open. It's easy to romanticise this, sitting here watching her seal the envelope with wax and a crest that doesn't belong to her. But the stakes are very real. Postmasters could be bribed, servants could be bought, letters could be intercepted and used as blackmail or court gossip. You begin to understand that writing like this was both an act of love and an act of espionage. There's one especially bizarre detail from this period. Some women, usually the ones at the top of their game, used trained birds to deliver their messages. Not pigeons like soldiers used, no. These were smaller, flashier things, exotic birds brought in from colonies taught to fly between specific rooftops. It was absurdly risky and even more absurdly stylish. One Italian courtesan famously trained a parrot to repeat a coded phrase, "He drinks the bitter wine alone." No one ever figured out what it meant, but the parrot squawked it from the windowsill every morning until it mysteriously vanished. So did she. Tonight's letter, however, is going by hand, delivered by a coachman who's been with her for years and knows exactly who to bribe and who to blackmail to get it past the front gate. As he disappears into the rain, she sits back and sips her wine, amber-coloured, thick and sweet as syrup. She's already writing another letter. This one starts, "My dearest enemy." In the world of 17th century courtesans, written language carried a different kind of intimacy. In-person seduction could be masked with perfume, performance, or wine, but a letter, that was stripped bare, and yet it was also a kind of shield, allowing the writer to be bold, playful, cutting, or erotic, without having to read the reaction in real time. Some letters were kept, read over and over, like sacred texts. Others were torn up the moment they were received, their message absorbed in secret. There's a debate among scholars about how many of these letters were genuine, and how many were ghost-written by friends, secretaries, or even failed playwrights desperate for cash. One theory suggests that an entire network of scribes existed solely to help courtesans maintain their letter-based empires. You wonder, would it really matter? Whether the words were hers or someone else's, the emotion behind them was real, or at least effective. You move through time again, flipping through memory and metaphor, until you're in a quiet study somewhere in the south of France. A nobleman, grey-haired, paunchy, trying very hard to seem indifferent, is reading a letter by firelight. His hand trembles just slightly. The wax seal lies broken on the floor. He's reading the part where she tells him he's the only man who's ever made her doubt herself. She doesn't mean it, but it's exactly what he needs to hear. He folds the letter carefully, places it in a velvet pouch, and tucks it into his coat like a secret love spell. Tomorrow he'll cancel a meeting. Next week he'll send her a ruby pendant shaped like a drop of blood. He's already hers again, and she hasn't even seen him in person in over a month. Back in the present, well, your present, you start to wonder what it must have felt like to be on the receiving end of one of these letters. To be seduced from 100 miles away, to feel like someone had carved your desires into ink just for you. In an era without text messages, these letters were portals. They made the absent feel present. They made fantasy feel real. And yet, there's a loneliness here too. You glance at the courtesan again, now leaning over the desk with her cheek in her palm. Her face is smeared with a bit of ink where she touched her temple without thinking. Her eyes look far away, not sad, not exactly, just tired. Writing like this takes something out of you. Giving so much of yourself over and over eventually begins to blur the line between honesty and strategy. She opens a drawer. Inside are dozens of letters bundled in faded ribbons. Some from clients, some never sent. You recognise the handwriting on a few. One in particular, sealed but clearly unread. She hesitates, then places it back, unopened. Some things aren't meant to be known, because that's the truth about this kind of seduction. It's not always reciprocal. Sometimes the most powerful courtesans were the loneliest women in the world. adored by men who never once asked what they wanted. And sometimes those letters were the only place they got to answer that question honestly. She dips her pen again. You watch the ink spread into the paper like dark lace. A new letter, a new performance, another move in the game. Come to me at dawn, she writes, and bring nothing but the truth. She'll never send it. By now you're starting to notice that the 1600s have their own language of intimacy, spoken not just in words or glances, but in smells. The air around a courtesan doesn't just carry perfume, it's part of the performance. A calling card, an atmosphere. Tonight, you follow the scent before you see her. Something floral, but not innocent. Not quite garden. There's a musk underneath it, warm, heady, and a little dangerous. It clings to the drapes. It coats your tongue. You're not walking into a room, you're entering an intention. Perfume in the 17th century isn't the little glass bottle you keep in your bathroom cabinet. It's an entire ritual, a blend of oils, resins, waxes, and even animal secretions. Yes, really. Musk from the glands of deer, ambergris scraped from the guts of sperm whales, civet from the backside of a cat-like creature no one wants to talk about. Sounds disgusting, and it kind of is. But once mixed with rose oil or orange blossom and aged in carved wooden boxes, it becomes something else entirely. Something irresistible. Courtesans knew the chemistry of seduction better than most apothecaries. They didn't just wear perfume, they layered it. First a rinse with rose water, then a body balm made from almond oil and beeswax, then dabs of personal scent in hidden places, behind the knees, beneath the earlobes, between the thighs. Some even perfumed their hair with sachets tucked inside elaborate wigs, or kept lace handkerchiefs soaked in scent between their breasts. To enter their presence was to be enveloped like walking into a story you didn't know you'd been cast in. She stands now in front of a brass vanity mirror, massaging a blend of cinnamon oil and crushed myrtle into her wrists. Her skin glistens in the candlelight. The smell is sweet but spicy, syrupy almost, and it starts to rise with the warmth of her pulse. You watch from the doorway, quiet. She knows you're there. Of course she does. But she doesn't acknowledge you just yet. She's finishing the story she's about to tell with her scent. A strange but delightful footnote. Back then, they believed certain perfumes could ward off disease. People thought scent had power, not just sensual, but spiritual. The right perfume could keep the plague away, or heartbreak, or jealousy. That last one was particularly popular. Elixirs made from crushed rosemary, lemon peel, and a drop of blood mixed with vinegar. Some courtesans even created signature blends meant to lock a man's heart. One infamous Italian blend was said to induce obsession. It contained crushed pearls, saffron, and just enough opium to leave the wearer dizzy. People lined up to buy it. And don't get her started on sweat. She tells you, half laughing, half serious, that true desire lives in the scent of skin. Not perfume, not oils, but the human smell beneath all of it. Some men, she says, beg not to bathe before a rendezvous. Others beg her not to. They want it raw, animal, sincere. A reminder that this isn't just performance, it's flesh. But there's a problem. Too much honesty in scent could be dangerous. Body odour wasn't just taboo, it was political. If a courtesan smelled wrong, it could signal poverty, illness, or worse, falling out of favour. So she balanced it. She used herbal rinses to keep her natural scent clean, then masked it with layers of curated aroma. She became a symphony. Sandalwood, frankincense, sweat, and maybe a trace of leather from the gloves she always wore when leaving the house. You remember hearing that some courtesans wore no perfume at all. It was their way of standing out, a blank space in a world saturated with scent. One woman in Madrid, known only as La Blanca, refused all oils, even in her hair. Men described her as smelling like clean linen and crushed rain. Whatever that meant, it worked. Her name kept appearing in the journals of at least 3 ambassadors, one of whom supposedly left his post for her, leaving behind a wife and a very confused mule. Historians are still baffled by the lack of consistency in scent-related customs across Europe during this time. In Paris, courtesans were scent-obsessed. In Amsterdam, they used it sparingly. In Florence, it depended on your status. Scholars still argue whether this was personal preference or an indicator of cultural influence. Did perfume trends travel with trade ships, or did they rise independently from local practices? One theory suggests that scent was a kind of class code. Too much, and you were vulgar. Too little, and you were suspiciously modest. She walks past you now, trailing fragrance like a veil. Not too close, just enough that your lungs ache a little. It's not a demand, it's a reminder. You won't forget her. Not tonight. Not ever. That scent will haunt your clothes and your dreams. Later, when you're lying in the same bed, her hair sprawled across the pillow, you realise her scent has changed. Softer, less layered. You catch the faintest trace of salt, sweat, tears, or both. She tells you stories in the dark about other men, other rooms, other nights that smelled of tobacco and regret. You ask her what you smell like. She says regret in advance. You don't know if it's a joke. The rain has stopped. Outside, the street glistens like wet marble. You can't tell where her skin ends and the scent begins. It's all one blur now, like memory, like lust, like history. You fall asleep with your nose pressed to her wrist, inhaling the last of her potion. And when you wake up alone, it's still there. The book is old, not fragile, not sacred, just secret, bound in cracked leather, pages the colour of old teeth, its spine stitched by hand. You're holding it now, flipping through stiff paper, trying not to crease anything, though part of you wants to smell it too. It's the kind of book that wasn't meant to survive, the kind courtesans kept hidden beneath floorboards or under false drawer bottoms. A book about sex, explicitly, elegantly, daringly so. And not just about the act, it's about the theory, the style, the intention behind it. In the 1600s, books like this weren't exactly at your local market. They were hand-copied, smuggled, read by candlelight and burned by morning. Some were disguised as poetry, others as medical texts or philosophy. But if you knew how to read between the lines, or in the margins where the real secrets lived, you'd find a kind of erotic education unmatched by anything you'd learn at church or court. Courtesans treated these books like textbooks, playbooks, confessionals. They annotated them, argued with them, improved them. You flip to a chapter labelled On the Rhythm of Breathing and the Pace of Desire. It reads more like choreography than instruction. Phrases like, let the silence swell between touches, and kiss, not as conquest but as compass. You glance around, though there's no one to see you blush. One of the most infamous manuals of the era was passed from woman to woman in Italian salons. Il Giardino Segreto, The Secret Garden. It was equal parts erotic fiction and philosophical treatise, exploring the moral alchemy of pleasure, how desire reveals character, how intimacy can elevate or debase a soul. Some versions were illustrated, woodcut prints of entwined bodies, faces mid-ecstasy, limbs tangled in impossible geometries. You're looking at one now, half shocked, half impressed. It's not just graphic, it's intentional. The hands are always touching with purpose. Every figure's expression is drawn with attention. No one here is passive. That's the real difference between a brothel manual and a courtesan's library. The former tells you where to touch, the latter teaches you why. One of the more bizarre finds. A French pamphlet from 1631 titled Le Petit Traité des Doigts, a little treatise on fingers et d'arvangers. Yes, just fingers. Entire passages discuss how the ring finger carries the quietest heat, and how the index should be used with restraint, lest it betray too much control. Some courtesans swore by this text, calling it the key to unlocking men who think they cannot be unlocked. It sounds absurd until you remember how few people in this era talked about real intimacy at all. You're now at a gathering in a cramped, book-filled salon, hosted by a former courtesan named Marguerite. She's in her 40s, too old for court, too sharp for retirement. She reads from one of her favourites, The Positions of Love in Prose and Pose. As she speaks, a young woman stands beside her, silently miming the instructions. A slight arch of the back, the weight on one foot, the hand sliding not to excite but to reassure. The room is silent, not leering, not laughing, just learning. There's a myth that women in the 1600s didn't talk about sex, that they were either innocent virgins or jaded professionals, but these books prove otherwise. They weren't just talking, they were debating. Some courtesans wrote their own annotations, critiquing techniques, suggesting better language. One margin reads, "He who speaks only of his own pleasure should not be invited back." Another, in firm slanted script, "Never forget the ear is more powerful than the thigh." But of course, these texts weren't just used by courtesans, they leaked. Slowly, deliberately. A nobleman might accidentally leave one on a side table. A curious wife might steal a glance. A scandalous friend might recite a line at a dinner party to peals of laughter and hidden blushes. And then, inevitably, someone would alert the church. Censorship was swift and absurd. Entire printings of books were seized and burned, printers fined, authors imprisoned. But the books kept reappearing, hand-copied, translated, smuggled in between cookbooks or bound inside prayer books. There are stories of midwives who kept pages folded into their skirts, not for titillation but for teaching. Scholars still debate the real origins of many of these works. Were they written by women, men pretending to be women, clerics with forbidden desires, channeling them into ink? Some believe the most famous manuals were penned by a group of literate courtesans operating under a single pseudonym. Others argue that the male voice is too dominant, that even in these so-called empowering texts, the female body is still being narrated, not narrating. It's an old debate, and one that never quite settles. But for the women who used them, who learned from them, lived by them, authorship mattered less than application. A passage on timing could change everything. One line about breath or laughter or fear, and suddenly the entire evening played differently. Courtesans weren't just reading these books, they were testing them, refining them, turning theory into touch. Back in the room you find a final passage underlined twice in faded ink. The most powerful gesture is the one that appears to be unintentional. You pause there, let the words settle, let them breathe. Marguerite sees you reading and leans in. "That line changed my entire career," she says, sipping her wine. Men think grand gestures impress, but it's the offhand remark, the accidental graze of a finger, the sigh they're not sure they heard, that's what undoes them. You close the book and set it gently on the velvet cushion beside her. You understand now that knowledge was part of the seduction, and that behind every sigh in the night, every shiver of anticipation, there might be a forgotten passage in a half-burned book, guiding the hands of someone who read it with a candle burning low and nothing left to lose. You're lying flat on a velvet chaise, still half drunk from a late dinner party where the wine tasted like cherries and something medicinal. Across from you, a woman plays a lute, her fingers moving with precise bored grace. Her dress is slightly undone at the shoulders, but she doesn't seem to care. Around you the room gleams with mirrors. Not just one or two, but dozens of all shapes and sizes. Oval, round, rectangular. Some framed in gilt, others edged in cracked glass. Each one tilted just slightly, catching fragments of candlelight and curves. And through all of it, your reflection, hers, the way her lips curve when she hits the right note, it feels like you've stumbled into a dream staged just for you. This is not an ordinary evening. This is the madrigal hour, she tells you, lifting her eyes with a smirk. You don't know what that means yet, but you don't ask. She'll tell you when she wants to. In the 1600s, performance and seduction weren't separate acts. For a courtesan, everything was a show, one where timing, lighting, and music mattered as much as touch. Madrigals were polyphonic vocal pieces, usually performed with multiple singers weaving intricate harmonies. But in the hands of a courtesan, they became something more personal, a spell, a flirtation in sound. Tonight, though, she's doing it solo. Her voice slips into the room like warm smoke, curling around the notes, softening the words. You can't tell if it's in Italian, French, or something older. The mirrors shimmer with every chord. That's no accident. Mirrors were deliberately placed, angled to catch glimpses of shoulder, mouth, ankle. Some courtesans had entire rooms designed to fracture the male gaze, reflecting him in ways he couldn't predict. One Venetian salon was said to have 27 mirrors arranged in such a way that a single gesture, say the lifting of a robe, could be seen from 8 perspectives at once, the illusion of intimacy magnified by geometry. Tonight's host, she goes by Callista, though you doubt that's her real name, leans forward mid-song and adjusts one of the mirrors beside her. You watch as your own face shifts, split into two by a line of golden filigree. She smiles just a little. Sometimes, she says, you have to show a man what he wants to believe. That's the thing with courtesans in this era. They understood the power of illusion long before theatre directors or painters did. They were lighting designers before the concept existed. Some kept mirrored boxes with pinprick holes that would turn candlelight into glittering stars. Others used coloured glass to tint their bodies in jewel-toned light. Blue for melancholy, red for longing, gold for triumph. Every surface, every shimmer was intentional. There's a strange little fringe fact you probably didn't expect. Courtesans were among the earliest adopters of optical trickery. One even collaborated with a lens grinder to develop what was essentially the prototype for a kaleidoscope, not for science, but for seduction. She used it to create fractal patterns of her body during performances, draping herself in silks and letting light refract across her skin, until men swore she had 3 arms or wings. Some believed she had magic. Others just emptied their coin purses in her name. And music. Oh, music was its own form of invitation. A well-placed lute, harp, or clavichord could signal so much. The melody wasn't just background, it was commentary. A descending scale could hint at surrender. A sharp trill, rejection, or maybe mockery. Some courtesans trained in conservatories, others learned by ear, mimicking the madrigals of court musicians, then subverting them, slowing the tempo, changing the key, twisting the lyrics into double entendre. Even the silence between notes could mean something, especially when paired with a slow glance through a mirror. You shift in your seat. The room feels warmer now, as though the air itself is responding. Callista finishes her song with a lingering chord, then turns the lute over gently in her lap. She doesn't bow, she doesn't need to. Instead, she stands and beckons you with one finger, not toward her, but toward a tall mirror framed in black wood. You approach it slowly. The reflection shows you both, side by side. But something feels off. You're smiling, but she's not. Or maybe it's the other way around. She leans close and says, "People trust their eyes too much." Then she presses her lips against your ear. Not a kiss, a suggestion, a silence shaped like a sentence. Later, the mirror fogs with breath. You watch yourself watching her, trying to remember where your body ends and hers begins. She tells you a story about a French duke who made her sing the same aria every night for a month, convinced there was a hidden message buried in the lyrics. There wasn't. But she pretended there was, drawing it out one syllable at a time, until he cried. Historians argue over how theatrical courtesans actually were. Some insist these elaborate setups were rare, exceptions not the norm. Others say that they were common, especially among elite women who could afford props and stagecraft. But the real debate is deeper. Was this art or manipulation? Were these women entertainers or emotional engineers? The answer is yes, and both, and something else entirely. The performance continues into the night. Another song, another mirror, another version of yourself reflected back at you. More attractive, more desired, more interesting. It's addictive, this version. You start to believe the illusion, even knowing it's curated. That's part of the pleasure. As dawn begins to seep through the heavy curtains, Callista opens a panel in the wall. It leads to a narrow hallway lined with more mirrors, all slightly warped. You walk down it slowly, seeing yourself bend, shrink, stretch. By the time you reach the other side, you're not sure who you are anymore, but you feel more alive than you have in years, and that's the lesson, really. For a courtesan, the body is just one tool. The voice, the mirror, the melody, the silence, they're all part of the seduction. Sex may be the final act, but everything else, the room, the light, the sound, that's the story. And she's the author. You're in a drafty hallway now, the kind that stretches far too long for no real reason, lined with portraits of people who never smile with their teeth. Each one stares down with powdered faces and sad eyes, dripping with lace and resentment. Welcome to the private wing of a minor French chateau, somewhere in Burgundy probably, though the place doesn't matter as much as what's happening inside it. You hear laughter down the corridor, low, nervous male. A creak of a bed frame, then silence. You're about to witness a lesson, not a schoolhouse lesson, not Latin declensions or court etiquette. This is the sex education of a nobleman, not the kind given by fumbling tutors or scandalous pamphlets, but the real curriculum. And the teacher? A courtesan so discreet her name isn't spoken aloud, only ever whispered, like a spell. She's been hired by the boy's uncle, discreetly of course, to prepare him for marriage. And you'd think that meant simply teaching him what goes where, but you'd be wrong, so wrong. She starts, strangely enough, with posture. "Don't lean like that," she tells him, tapping his shoulder with a fan. "You look like a terrified goat." The boy is maybe 17, maybe less, all limbs and sweat. She circles him like a fencing instructor, correcting the way he breathes, how he looks at her, how he stands when someone undresses him. Confidence is the first seduction, she says, and the last. What follows is a masterclass, but not the kind you'd expect. She doesn't jump straight into anatomy or acrobatics. No, she begins with questions. What do you think she's afraid of, she asks, referring to his future bride. What makes her hesitate? The boy stammers something about modesty, maybe nerves. She frowns. No, she says, she's afraid that you won't see her. In this moment, you realise she's not teaching sex, she's teaching presence. The ability to hold attention gently to make a partner feel not possessed, but seen. It's not romantic, it's strategic. Because in a world where marriages are arranged, bodies are commodities, and emotional literacy is practically a myth, what she's offering is survival skill. Empathy disguised as eroticism. She teaches him how to touch. Not roughly, not fearfully. She places his hand on her own wrist and tells him to pay attention to pulse, to temperature. Women don't melt for fingers, she says. They melt for attention. Then she teaches him silence, how to wait before moving, how to use a pause like punctuation. The boy's face flushes so brightly you think his wig might catch fire. There's an awkward moment when he tries to kiss her without cue. She leans away and stares. No, she says, not unkindly. You kiss when you've been given the story of her mouth, not just the shape of it. He sits down hard on the edge of the bed, mortified. She sits beside him. It's all right, she says. Every man starts there. The good ones learn. You sit back in the shadows and realise how many of these lessons aren't physical at all. She talks about scent, how to smell clean without smelling like a soap factory, how to use his voice, never too low, never too fast, how to notice when a woman breathes differently. That's the moment, she says. That breath, that's the doorway. One particularly odd tidbit. Some courtesans taught young nobles how to undress themselves gracefully. Apparently removing stockings without looking ridiculous was harder than it seemed. There were whole rituals around it. Don't tug too fast, don't step on one boot to remove the other, it looks lazy. One manual even suggested making eye contact during each layer's removal. Strip like a poem, it said, leave a verse with every fold, and then finally when he's relaxed enough to listen, she teaches anatomy. But again, not just in the expected way. She draws on her own thigh with a charcoal stick, tracing shapes, explaining pressure points. Most men aim for the obvious, she says, but the true pleasure lives in the forgotten places, behind the knee, the side of the neck, the curve between ribs. You must treat the body like a map, she says. Not all treasure is buried in the same place. Historians love to speculate about this part of a young aristocrat's education. Some insist it was common, almost traditional, for noble boys to be broken in by experienced courtesans before marriage. Others argue that's myth-making, an erotic fantasy applied retroactively to dull political unions. But letters, journals, and private records suggest it happened more often than anyone liked to admit, and more than a few highborn women confessed, in carefully coded language, that they could tell the difference between a lover who had been educated and one who had not. The boy thanks her too quickly. She laughs softly and hands him a linen cloth to wipe his face. You're not done, she says. The real test comes when you forget everything I told you and just listen. By now it's nearly dawn. The candles are low, their wax pooling on silver trays. The boy leaves the room quietly, his footsteps uncertain but lighter. She watches him go without expression. Then she closes the door, unties her corset, and exhales for the first time in hours. You ask if it ever gets easier. She shrugs. It's not about easy, she says. It's about giving someone the tools to not become their father. And for a moment, you wonder what would happen if this kind of education had been taught more widely, if desire had been taught not as conquest or duty, but as communication. She lies back on the bed and says to no one in particular, "It'll be clumsy but kind. That's enough for a start. And you're in a cellar now, the kind of damp, flickering place where forbidden things are kept. Bottled wines, half-truths, and hand-carved erotic woodcuts. The kinds that don't make it into history books unless someone finds them stuffed in a wall centuries later and gasps so hard they drop their latte. Tonight someone rolls out a small bundle of linen and untucks a stack of stiff yellowed paper. You lean in, your eyes adjust, and there they are. Positions, poses, entire scenes etched in painstaking detail by someone who clearly had more than a casual interest in flexibility. This isn't art for art's sake. This is instruction. Subversive, seductive, explicit. Each image has been rendered with a mix of anatomical curiosity and theatrical flair. A couple reclines on a chaise, mid-embrace, their limbs entangled like ivy. Another image features a group scene so creatively arranged it may require a compass and a diagram to follow. And yes, the genitals are front and centre, but so are the faces, and the eyes, the expressions, the drama of it all. These weren't your average barmaid pin-ups. No, these woodcuts were part of a quiet sexual revolution. The visual manuals of the courtesan class, smuggled from artist studios to salons to lovers' bedchambers. Often tucked behind innocent book covers or stitched into false bottoms of travel chests, they circulated in silence. No one ever admitted to owning them, yet somehow everyone seemed to have seen them. They were passed under tables, over cushions, behind tapestries, and sometimes, believe it or not, inside bread baskets. Yes, actual bread hollowed out and filled with smut. The most risque croissants Europe has ever known. One such illustration catches your eye. A couple is shown mid-kiss, but it's not their bodies that draw you in, it's the way their hands are drawn. Not clutching, but open, hovering. It's not lust, it's reverence. And somehow that makes the image feel more intimate than all the exposed thighs and suggestively curved hips on the surrounding pages. Courtesans didn't just use these images to arouse, they used them to teach, to prepare, to offer options that wouldn't be discussed in polite society, or in marriage for that matter. These woodcuts offered possibilities. Permission, the idea that sex could be shaped like art, not just duty. A certain French collection, lovingly dubbed Les Jeux du Lit, the games of the bed, was passed among elite women in coded packages tied with ribbons. Every illustration had a title: the blossoming tulip, the stolen staircase, the swan's bow, flowery, yes, but the content, not subtle. You ask the woman showing you the prints, tall, sharp, with ink stains on her cuffs, if these were accurate or aspirational. She snorts. Both, she says. Some were warnings, others were goals. She explains that courtesans would sometimes commission custom illustrations to help train younger women. A sort of visual shorthand for techniques, rhythm, and body language. Not everyone learns the same way, she says. Some need touch, others need words, but some need to see. In one corner of the room, a girl no older than 16 studies a diagram with the focus of a mathematician solving for X. And yes, not all of it was refined. Some prints were downright comical, over-exaggerated this, anatomy, ridiculous positions, and one unfortunate German copy that depicted an orgy atop a horse-drawn carriage. No one could explain the logistics. Still, the point was clear: sex was not fixed. It could be played with, laughed at, reimagined. Here's something deliciously weird. In some cities you could rent these woodcuts. Quietly, of course. A client could request a specific set, the widow's recline or the rope and the curtain, and a messenger would deliver them wrapped in wax paper, collect them 2 days later, and leave behind a fresh bottle of rosewater as thanks. A kind of underground library of sensuality. Historians still squabble over how widely these images circulated. Were they truly used by courtesans, or were they produced for the male gaze, then co-opted by women out of necessity? Some believe they were tools of resistance, a way to reclaim visual space to assert desire, without asking for permission. Others argue they simply reflect fantasy, not practice. But when you look at the care put into each face, the unhurried line work around fingers, the emphasis on shared gaze, you don't see male fantasy, you see conversation, you see agency. One print sticks with you. A woman sits upright, eyes locked with her partner's, her hand resting lightly on his chest as if measuring his heartbeat. The caption below reads, "The moment before, that's all." And suddenly the entire image deepens. It's not about the act, it's about timing, anticipation, that suspended breath right before skin meets skin. The woman rolls up the prints and tucks them back into their cloth, tying the bundle with casual precision. She nods at you. They don't teach these things anymore, she says. Not because they're obscene, but because they're effective. And she's right. These prints didn't just depict sex, they mapped it. They proposed that pleasure was more than friction. It was architecture, a composition, something that could be improved, practiced, mastered, and they handed that knowledge to those who were never supposed to have it. You step back into the cold hallway, the flicker of candlelight still dancing in your mind. You've seen things tonight that will follow you. Images etched not just on wood, but somewhere deeper. The next time someone looks at you with hunger, you'll remember the moment before and wonder what they're really after. Your body, or your breath. And either way, you'll know how to respond. Tonight, the candles are arranged in a circle, their flames small and stubborn against the draught that slips through the cracks in the stone walls. You're in a room that smells like old wood, melted wax, and something green and sharp. Rosemary, maybe? Or mugwort. A courtesan, barefoot, ageless, and smiling like she knows what you're about to ask, kneels at the centre, arranging small bundles of herbs wrapped in ribbon. This isn't seduction, not directly. This is ritual. The courtesans of the 1600s didn't just know how to stir hearts and loins. They knew how to stir potions, fertility, desire, attraction, and even protection. All of it was part of their quiet, fragrant knowledge. They weren't witches, at least not officially. But they practiced what might look very close to magic, especially to men who didn't know better. Tonight, you're learning about the bedroom's hidden ingredients, the charms slipped under pillows, the oils dabbed on inner thighs, the dried fruit soaked in wine and whispered over at midnight. Sex in this era was soaked in myth. People believed in humours, in bodily vapours, in cosmic timing. And courtesans, they knew how to turn that superstition into leverage. Because if a man thinks you've enchanted him, he'll return. And if he returns, you win. The courtesan before you, she calls herself Amélie tonight, pours a mixture of red wine, crushed clove, and honey into a small ceramic cup. Drink it before you ask for anything, she tells you. It softens your voice. You drink. It burns a little, then coats your throat like velvet. She nods, satisfied. Better, she says. She shows you a pouch of dried apple seeds and yarrow. For conception, she explains. Not her own, of course, never her own, but for the wives and mistresses of men who came to her desperate. A nobleman who had been married 10 years without children. A merchant's second wife who feared replacement. They never thank you properly, Amélie says, but they always remember. One particularly strange little fact. In parts of Italy and southern France, some women believed that placing a walnut between their breasts during sex would ensure a male child. Why a walnut? No one knows. Maybe it was the shape. Maybe it was just something someone swore worked once and then it caught on like wildfire. Courtesans played along, sometimes they even gilded the nuts, sold them for 10 times the price, and called them golden suns. Another item from her collection, a red ribbon tied around a sprig of rue. Keeps away jealousy, she explains, but only if you burn it while he's looking at you. That part seems important. She taps her temple, then yours. Men only fear what they can see. You notice a small dish of melted wax nearby, hardened now into the shape of a heart. She'd dripped it into water the night before after asking her client to think of his true desire. It's never who they say, she murmurs. The wax knows. You raise an eyebrow but say nothing. Maybe you believe her. Maybe the point isn't believing, it's understanding why people need to believe. And they did believe. In Paris, it was common for wealthy women to visit herbalists, often ex-courtesans themselves, looking for mixtures that promised everything from a husband's fidelity to better dreams. One recipe included ground lavender, dried pear skin, and a single strand of the husband's hair, tied around a clove and boiled for 3 nights. Supposedly, if he drank even a drop of the resulting tea, he'd fall asleep muttering your name. Creepy? Maybe, but effective, who's to say? Scholars have long dismissed these rituals as nonsense, quaint folk traditions wrapped in candle smoke, but new research suggests otherwise. These weren't random gestures. They were systems, recipes, codes. They were passed from woman to woman like currency, and when you didn't have money or title, a charm that could make someone love you, or even just listen to you, was priceless. Amélie walks you over to a low table covered in parchment scraps. Each one has symbols, tiny ink drawings, or single words scrawled in Latin, Italian, Greek. Some are prayers, some are curses. One reads only, sanguis inflamma, blood inflame. You don't ask what it's for, you probably don't want to know. Then comes the bath. Not for cleanliness, for intention. She fills a copper tub with herbs, chamomile, rose petals, sage, and pours in warmed goat milk. She drops in coins from 5 different provinces, a trick to attract wealthy travellers. Let it cool, she says. Then soak. Think about what you want them to see when they look at you. This isn't about spells, not really. It's about focus. You realise that every step, every mix of herbs, every whispered name, and every soft breath drawn before a touch isn't superstition. It's preparation, the kind that slows your heartbeat, clears your mind, trouble, and makes you present. Maybe the magic is just what happens when someone believes they are more than just a body. And don't think for a moment the men were immune. One courtesan reportedly fed her client a syrup made from saffron and pomegranate seed before every meeting. He claimed it made his hand steadier and his heart lighter. Another pressed a rose petal under the tongue of a Spanish envoy and told him it would make her taste sweeter. He begged for her for months after. Sometimes they brought her flowers, sometimes weapons. One brought his wife. You ask Amelie if she believes in any of it. She smiles. Belief isn't the point, she says. They do. That's enough. You leave with a sachet tucked into your coat. It smells of cinnamon, basil, and something else you can't name. She says to place it beneath your bed, but only on nights when you want to remember. Later, when the moon rises and the room is still, you find yourself reaching for it. Not because you think it's magic, but because you're starting to understand that sometimes the line between ritual and reality is thinner than a red ribbon tied around a sprig of rue. And sometimes it smells like a memory you haven't made yet. It's nearly silent inside the convent. The kind of silence that presses against your skin, makes you speak in whispers even when no one's around. You're standing in a long stone hallway, lit by shafts of morning light slicing in through narrow arched windows. Somewhere down the corridor, a bell tolls. You hear the echo of footsteps, slow, deliberate, slippered. A young nun passes by with a stack of linens in her arms. She gives you a polite nod. Her eyes linger half a second longer than they should. Welcome to the strangest secret of the 1600s. Not all the chastity in convents was as untouched as it looked. You've stepped into the space where sacred vows and carnal whispers collided, where celibacy was preached but not always practiced. And if that sounds scandalous, well, it was, quietly, carefully, almost artistically. Convents were in many ways a refuge. Not all women there were pious or called to spiritual life. Some were born into families who couldn't or wouldn't afford to marry them off. Some were second or third daughters, sent to live among stone and scripture so they wouldn't become anyone's problem. Others came voluntarily, fleeing bad marriages, or worse, reputations, and among them were a few who knew more about seduction than any priest ever dared imagine. The woman you meet today calls herself Sister Eleanor. She tends the garden, reads the psalms, makes her own ink from ash and blackberry and, after compline, once the abbess is asleep, teaches the younger sisters things they were never supposed to know. She speaks gently, moves slowly, but there's something sharp behind her gaze, like a candle that won't go out. You sit with her in a tiny room that smells of lavender and old books. She pours tea laced with lemon balm and tells you about the visits, noblemen, merchants, diplomats, some seeking penance, others pretending to. They came for confession, sure, but some stayed longer than they should. Some offered donations, food, protection. Some asked for prayers. Others asked for warmth. And sometimes, rarely but memorably, they got it. There are rumours, always. A bishop who fathered a child in a convent in Naples. A nun in Bruges, whose private writings were found to contain not just psalms, but detailed instructions on erotic massage. A group of sisters in Milan who hosted moon rituals that conveniently aligned with the arrival of certain male visitors. All of it dismissed as gossip, but as Eleanor says with a shrug, where there is smoke there was probably someone very flustered trying to hide a candle. She leads you through the garden, pointing out herbs that serve multiple purposes. Sage for clarity, rue for cleansing, mandrake, dangerous if misused, powerful if not. We call it the root of dreaming, she says, brushing dirt from a sprig with her thumb. Too much, and you forget who you are. Just enough, and you remember who you were. She doesn't say it, but you understand desire was not banished here. It was buried, managed, rerouted, turned into something quieter, more dangerous. There's a reason so many mystics describe their love for God in the language of lovers. Yearning, ache, surrender. Some of the most erotic texts of the century were written by women who had taken vows of silence. They just whispered to different things. One peculiar historical fact stands out. During the 1600s, convents were among the largest producers of ink and parchment in several regions, Why? Unofficially for copying religious texts. Unofficially for journaling, for letters. For writing things that couldn't be said aloud. A few surviving pages, anonymous of course, describe dreamscapes, longing, even touches. One, found hidden in the binding of a prayer book, reads, "She came to me in white and whispered all the names I'd forgotten I had." No one knows who wrote it, but whoever she was, she remembered. There's still scholarly debate about how prevalent these secret affairs really were. Some say they were isolated incidents, exceptions to a generally pious rule. Others argue that the convent was the perfect environment for forbidden relationships to grow, intimacy behind closed doors, emotional bonds, a lack of male supervision, and not just with visitors, with each other. The church condemned particular friendships between nuns, an oddly delicate euphemism for affection that leaned into intimacy. But how much of that was real, and how much was fear projected by a church obsessed with control? Eleanor stops by the chapel door and presses your hand. Her fingers are warm and worn. She smiles faintly. "There's more than one kind of hunger," she says, "and not all of it ends at the mouth. You notice now the carvings in the wood beams above. They look like flowers at first, roses, lilies, the usual. But then you see one that looks oddly like a fig, and another like two hands, not in prayer, but entwined. Subtle, quiet defiance carved in holy wood. Messages for those who knew how to read them. Before you leave, she gives you a scrap of linen, folded neatly, scented faintly of frankincense and rose. Inside it, a single sentence written in spidery hand. You cannot touch the body without touching the soul, no name, no explanation, and just that. Later that night, as you rest in the small guest room near the cloister, you hear soft singing from down the hall. Not hymns, something slower, older. You don't understand the words, but the ache in them is universal. And you think about all the women in stone walls across centuries holding desire like a flame cupped in their hands, never extinguished, only hidden. You're backstage now, not in a theatre exactly, but somewhere that feels just as choreographed. Velvet curtains hang like sleeping giants, and gas lamps flicker against cracked plaster walls. You hear the rustle of skirts, the clink of jewellery, and the practised exhale of a woman calming her heartbeat before her cue. A courtesan stands before a full-length mirror, adjusting the tilt of her head with the precision of a dancer. She's not on stage yet, but she might as well be. Tonight, she performs the body. This is the theatre of the 1600s, not just opera houses and candlelit stages, but boudoirs, salons and private chambers, places where the performance didn't end with applause, it ended in bed. Or not at all, because for courtesans the performance wasn't just a show, it was survival. She smooths her sleeves and glides across the room like water poured from a silver cup. You watch her rehearse a laugh, test a line of poetry, then drop into a curtsy so graceful it feels like a spell. This isn't vanity, it's technique, and behind every tilt of the wrist or arch of the brow is intention. You think seduction is instinct? Think again. For women like her, it's rehearsed like a monologue. In the 16th century, courtesans didn't just sleep with men, they performed for them. And not just during sex. At dinners, they played the harpsichord, recited poetry, told stories with punchlines timed like sonnets. At salons, they debated philosophers, mimicked noble women with scandalous accuracy, and delivered gossip with just enough truth to cause a stir. Their bodies were part of the act, sure, but their voices were often sharper. A well-trained courtesan knew how to enter a room so that everyone noticed, but no one could say why. She knew how to feign surprise without actually being surprised. How to cry with one eye and smirk with the other. It wasn't just charm, it was theatre. And the audience? Always watching, always paying. Here's a quirky little historical gem. Some courtesans trained with actual stage actors, especially comedic performers. Why? Because timing is everything. Laughter is foreplay. You want to be remembered? Make a man laugh and think he came up with the joke. Several famous Venetian courtesans were known to give private performances dressed as male characters, mimicking the pompous voices of cardinals or the nasal whine of their patrons' wives. Not everyone laughed, but the ones who did came back, with gifts. You shift on your feet and ask her, this courtesan who calls herself Belladonna tonight, how long it takes to master the act. She rolls her eyes. There is no mastery, she says, only illusion. She reaches behind her and unties the stays of her gown, letting it slide off her shoulder with a practised shrug. You think this is easy? She asks. Try making a man believe he chose you, after you spent 6 weeks choosing him. And don't forget the walk. Courtesans had signature walks. Fluid, gliding, with just enough sway to hint but not scream. One famous Parisian performer reportedly practiced her steps between 2 lines of stacked books, each topped with pearls. If the pearls fell, she started over. Another was said to have rehearsed her entrance into salons by descending staircases with different emotional narratives. Heartbreak, triumph, mischief. Each one had a different rhythm, a different breath. Scholars have tried to trace the origin of this body theatre. Was it inspired by court masks, by commedia dell'arte? Some say courtesans co-opted male gestures and filtered them through sensuality. Others argue they were reacting against the limited roles available to women elsewhere. If you couldn't be a duchess or a playwright, you could at least be unforgettable. And what better way to be remembered than by becoming a walking story? You ask Belladonna if it ever gets exhausting. Of course, she says, but exhaustion is part of the performance. The droop of the shoulder, the sigh, the moment they ask if you're okay. That's when they start to feel something. She smiles, and once they feel, they're yours. She moves toward a small stage tucked behind a curtain, a raised platform with a single chair and a glass of wine. She doesn't invite you to sit. She takes the chair herself. Then she begins a story, slow, winding, almost hypnotic. It's about a general who tried to win her with war medals and a baker who did it with bread. You laugh. She lets the laughter build. Then she softens, her voice drops. But it was the poet, she says, who left me letters shaped like birds. She lets the silence hang. Performance, you realise, isn't about spectacle. It's about pacing and presence. The ability to hold a room in the palm of your hand without squeezing. You remember something odd from earlier. A rumour that some courtesans trained their breath to match the tempo of music played during dinner parties, syncing themselves with the room's rhythm so no one noticed they were in control. Is that true? Maybe, maybe not. But you believe it now, because sitting here, watching Belladonna toy with silence, you feel the room itself begin to shift toward her. She stands, walks to you. Her movement is effortless, like a well-timed reveal in a play you didn't realise you were part of. I'm not trying to make you want me, she says. I'm trying to make you want yourself, in the moment I've built for you. You're not sure if that's a confession or a warning. Later, as she disappears behind the curtain, you hear applause from another room. Someone else is performing now. But for you, the show is over. You've seen how it works, the way performance becomes personality, the way desire is choreographed, the way a courtesan doesn't just inhabit her body, she directs it, like a scene. And for the first time you realise you've been acting too. The whole time. You're lying on a low cushioned table. The wood beneath you creaks just slightly, warm from the fire burning a few feet away. The room smells like smoke and mint, like skin and something earthy. A woman, older than the others you've met, Karma, stands beside you with a bowl of steaming water and a stack of linen cloths folded so precisely they look sacred. She says nothing at first, just rolls your sleeve up, dips a cloth in the bowl, wrings it out and places it gently on your chest. The heat sinks in like memory. This is not seduction, not directly, this is care. Erotic, yes, but not in the ways you expect. This is where courtesans crossed into the world of medicine, or perhaps where medicine crossed into intimacy. You're in a private chamber of what would now be called a wellness space. Then, just a room off a brothel, or behind a theatre, or above an apothecary's shop, a place where pleasure and healing braided into something else entirely. Back then, physical medicine was less about charts and more about temperature, touch, and trust. The body was read like a letter. Warmth, cold, tension, pulse. And courtesans, trained in far more than flirtation, often knew as much about healing as the local physician, especially the unlicensed ones. They studied anatomy when they could, experimented when they must, and learned from each other what worked and what didn't. They didn't call it wellness, of course. They called it keeping a man from falling apart too fast and occasionally keeping yourself alive long enough to matter. She moves to your feet now, presses her thumbs into the arch just so, and you flinch. You hold fear here, she says. Too much movement, too little rest. You blink. You didn't say anything. She knows anyway. That's the difference between hands trained to touch for want and hands trained to touch for meaning. A strange but lovely historical detail. In the 1600s, massage was considered a legitimate form of medical treatment when done by the right person. And more often than not, the right person was a woman who knew how to modulate pressure like a lullaby. Courtesans weren't officially doctors, but in some courts, they were called on more than physicians when a nobleman fell ill or suffered exhaustion from overwork or too many mistresses. A courtesan knew the lines of a back better than most surgeons. She didn't just need muscles, she read them. She moves up to your shoulders, where tension lives like squatters. Her hands are cool now, slick with something scented, perhaps oil of juniper or almond with a touch of sage. Her fingertips find knots that feel like regret, and she doesn't rush them. Courtesans didn't believe in rushing. They knew that slowness had a kind of holiness to it. You ask her where she learned. She smiles without looking at you. From a midwife? From an actor? From a man who believed I was sent to torment him, but paid me anyway. She moves to your scalp, and you forget what you were going to ask next. Not all the healing was physical. Some courtesans specialised in emotional mending, listening more deeply than any priest. One, known only as La Rousse, was famous for asking a single question before anything else. When did someone last tell you the truth? She would hold a man's hand for hours before ever undressing. Not every client wanted pleasure. Some wanted permission to weep. There's a story, probably embroidered by time, of a courtesan in Florence who refused to sleep with her clients until she had massaged their neck and hands. No one can receive joy, she said, with a stiff spine and fists clenched. Her sessions cost more than a full week's wages for most men, and she always lit 2 candles, one for healing and one for remembering. That part never changed. Debate still circles among historians about whether this kind of practice, this sensual tending, was part of a courtesan's formal education or just something they learned through necessity. Some claim there were underground schools, almost like apprenticeships, where older courtesans taught younger ones not just how to arouse, but how to soothe. Others say it was picked up through experience, intuition, desperation, but no one denies its effectiveness. She places one hand on your heart now, not pressing, just resting there like she's listening for a song beneath your ribs. The body remembers everything, she murmurs, even what you try to forget. You don't move, you don't speak. You're afraid that if you do, whatever she's found will disappear back into the cracks of your bones. Touch, when given without demand, has its own kind of eroticism, not the urgent kind, the kind that says, I see you, and I don't need anything from you. Courtesans knew how rare that was, and they made it their secret art. She lifts her hand, the room feels heavier without it. There's a small table nearby with bowls of heated stones, lavender leaves drying on cloth, and a collection of smooth seashells arranged in a spiral. For listening, she says. You pick one up and hold it to your ear. No ocean, just your own blood moving. Before you go, she hands you a vial of thick amber-coloured oil. For when you forget that your body is more than function, she says. You ask if it's for massage. She shakes her head. No, she says. It's for remembering softness. On days when you think you have to be steel. And as you step out into the early dusk, skin warm and scent still clinging to you like memory, you wonder how many others walked out of that room having discovered that healing and arousal weren't opposites after all. They were twins, just separated at birth. You're back in a palace tonight, one of the big ones with too many rooms and not enough secrets left to keep. The marble floors are cold even through your shoes, and the air smells faintly of musk, beeswax, and too many egos in one place. You wander through a gilded corridor and find yourself in a drawing room, where a conversation is unfolding like a lace fan. 3 women in towering wigs sip wine that looks more like syrup than liquid, and the man they're teasing, an aging count with a face like boiled mutton, is pretending not to mind that they keep glancing at his chest instead of his eyes. Then the topic shifts. Quietly, suddenly. One woman leans in and whispers a name. Madame de Berry. The Count freezes, wine halfway to his mouth. You've heard the name too, not because she led an army or wrote a symphony, but because of her nipples. Yes, her nipples. In the 1600s, a single flash of skin could rattle a throne. Courtesans knew this, and the smart ones, like Madame de Berry, used it. Not carelessly, strategically. Her dress at the king's midsummer ball revealed a neckline so low it caused an entire ecclesiastical scandal. But it wasn't the neckline that started the trouble. It was the glimmer of gold leaf she'd painted across the top of her breasts, shaped into tiny sunbursts, just enough to catch the candlelight and suggest, without fully revealing what everyone was already thinking about. The king didn't look away, neither did the archbishop, and 3 weeks later, a treaty negotiation fell through that had absolutely nothing to do with trade routes. This is the power of the body as politics. Courtesans weren't just beautiful, they were strategic. A bare shoulder here, an exposed ankle there, every inch of revealed skin was a chess move. And in a time when men wore powdered wigs and carried swords but still panicked over the glimpse of a clavicle, the right reveal could ruin or rule. You sit now with a different courtesan, older, seasoned, a bit wicked. She calls herself Lisette, though that's probably not the name she was born with. She's sprawled across a fainting couch in a robe the colour of ripe cherries, sipping tea that smells like dried violets. You'd be amazed what a nipple can do, she says, one eyebrow raised. Wars have been paused for less. She's not wrong. One curious little historical side note. In some royal courts there were actual debates about how much décolletage was acceptable. One duchess reportedly measured her rivals' necklines at a banquet and reported them to the queen. Another had lace panels sewn into her bodice that she could subtly remove mid-conversation, depending on the power dynamic in the room. Courtesans took this idea and ran with it. They used the body not as bait, but as message. Take the infamous case of the French ambassador's mistress. At a formal event, she entered the ballroom with a live bird perched at her collarbone, wings spread across her chest, the feathers concealed just enough to avoid arrest, but not enough to avoid attention. By the end of the evening, she'd secured a new suite of apartments, a diamond brooch, and 2 invitations to private salons previously closed to her. The bird released into the garden like a myth. The deeper you go into this world, the more you understand that seduction wasn't about pleasure. It was about leverage. Courtesans lived in a constant state of performance, and their costumes were their contracts. Silk, satin, and skin stitched into statements. The right dress could say, "I'm untouchable," or "Touch me and everything you love will crumble." The wrong dress could end you. Some of the courtesans even wrote manuals on it, or had them ghost-written. A recovered fragment from 1692 includes notes like, "Pearl powder on shoulders, not face. Candlelight favours gold tones. Lace that mimics flame draws the gaze upward. And perhaps most famously, cover your secrets with confidence, not cloth." Historians sometimes struggle with how to classify this kind of power. It wasn't formal. It wasn't military or financial. It was embodied, performative, ephemeral, but real. When a king's mistress hinted that she favoured a specific noble's boots, the man's political standing improved. When a courtesan refused a dance, it could send rumours spiralling through an entire court. And when a woman like Madame de Berry let the light kiss the top of her breast in the right moment, well, an entire bishopric could go into a tailspin. Lisette pulls you back to the present with a chuckle. "The real trick," she says, setting down her cup, "is making them think it was their idea to look." She stands, brushes non-existent dust from her robe, and walks to the mirror. She adjusts her bodice, just a little. You notice it. Of course you do, that's the point. And here's where it gets even weirder. Nipple gossip didn't just stay in the salon or the ballroom. It travelled. It turned up in plays, poems, even court documents. A record from a trial in Brussels mentions a courtesan who weaponized her bosom with insidious success. What does that even mean? You don't know, but you're sure it worked. You leave the room feeling slightly dizzy. Not from wine, from the realization that a single square inch of skin could alter history. That the female body, when wielded with intention, didn't just disrupt systems, it rewrote them. Quietly, elegantly, one sunlit shoulder at a time. Later that night, as you lie in bed, you picture candlelight dancing across pale skin, catching in the fine shimmer of powdered gold. You think of the whispered names, the narrowed eyes, the treaties that never happened. And you finally understand why kings feared courtesans far more than soldiers. There's a door in front of you, thick, lacquered and painted black, with an iron knocker shaped like a lion's paw. No number, no name, just a red silk ribbon tied loosely around the handle. That's the invitation. You knock. The door swings open without a sound. A woman in a white mask and a floor-length wig gestures you inside, says nothing, and vanishes. You're not sure whether to follow or run, but you're here now. Welcome to the chamber where wigs, whips and role-play are all part of the lesson plan. In the 1600s, not everything about sex was soft sighs and candlelight. Sometimes it was loud, dangerous, scripted, wild. And sometimes it was something entirely stranger. Desire not as spontaneity, but as performance, pushed to its furthest, most ridiculous and most thrilling limits. What happened behind these heavy doors wasn't for the faint of heart or fragile of ego, but for courtesans, it was business, it was theatre, and in its own way it was liberation. You're led through a corridor lit only by lanterns shaded in crimson silk. The shadows stretch long and tall like something out of a dream, or a memory you never had but somehow miss. You arrive in a room covered entirely in drapes. Not a single wall is visible. The furniture is baroque, oversized and suspiciously easy to clean. A low table holds objects that look medical, or maybe musical, or maybe ceremonial. Leather cuffs, feather fans, ivory masks, a heavy book bound in red velvet with no title on the spine, a single glove made of black lace resting, like it's waiting for a hand, or a story. A man waits on his knees, bare from the waist up, a blindfold wrapped around his eyes. A courtesan circles him, dressed not in a gown but in a man's waistcoat, unlaced at the front. She's holding a riding crop with a pearl-studded handle. She taps the floor twice. He flinches, not in fear, in readiness. And you realise you're watching a scene unfold, but it's not about pain or dominance or even pleasure. It's about consent, agreement. It's a fantasy with rules, role-play in the truest sense. This isn't chaos, it's choreography. In this era, the bedroom could be more than a private space, it could be a stayeu. And courtesans were playwrights and performers all at once. Some kept trunks filled with costumes, nuns' habits, royal robes, maid uniforms, even men's clothing tailored for their hips. Others maintained personas with names, accents, and invented pasts that changed depending on the client. You could spend the night with a pirate queen, a stoic swordswoman, or a widowed duchess with a taste for poetry and revenge, for a price. And the wigs? Oh, the wigs were everything. Towering constructions of hair, feathers, glass beads, and occasionally small mechanical birds. Each one told a story. The higher the wig, the more outrageous the fantasy. A popular roleplay involved Marie de Medici wigs styled like ships at sea. Clients pretending to be rescued sailors, brought to shore for recovery. Courtesans even wrote scripts for the men too nervous to improvise. One woman reportedly charged extra for performance coaching, including breathwork and line readings. She said shy men were her favourite. They follow stage directions. Here's a bizarre historical tidbit. In London and Paris, some courtesans hired set designers, yes, real ones from the theatre, to create changeable bedroom scenes. Forests, courts, altars, even caves. One notorious favourite, a mock confessional booth with velvet curtains and 2 entrances. The roles of priest and sinner rotated depending on mood. It was said that certain bishops privately funded these designs under false names. The line between penance and indulgence got confusing. You sit quietly as the courtesan taps the blindfolded man's shoulders with the crop, left, then right, then down his spine. He breathes in a pattern she clearly taught him. She never raises her voice, she commands without shouting. The room watches. And when she finally removes his blindfold and whispers something in his ear, he exhales like someone who's just been forgiven, or baptized, or broken open. Roleplay at its core is not deception. It's honesty filtered through artifice. The freedom to act out something unspeakable without judgment, without history, without the crushing weight of self-awareness. Courtesans understood this intuitively. They offered clients the safety of unreality. You want to be a servant tonight, a prisoner, a god? Done. But only if you follow the rules. And there were rules, always. Code words, taps, signals. A courtesan didn't just lead, she protected. She read the room constantly, adjusted the scene if someone strayed too far into discomfort or danger. The illusion was complete, but never careless. Scholars still argue whether these chambers were common or rare. Whispers suggest they were more widespread than records admit, because they were expensive, yes, but also discreet. It was easier to hide a role-play salon behind a tailor's shop than to explain why your senator cousin was wearing a feathered mask and tied to a chair. Most evidence comes from private letters, intercepted journals, and the occasional drawing smuggled in a sleeve. One anonymous sketch simply titled Thursday shows 3 figures in wigs and nothing else. reenacting a courtroom scene with a gavel carved from ivory and an audience of one. You stand to leave, but the courtesan catches your wrist, gently. She leans close and says, "Tell me, if you could play any part tonight, who would you be?" The question is simple, but it sticks. Because you realise it's not about what role you'd play, it's about who you'd become when no one was watching, or when everyone was and no one knew your name. You walk out past the masked woman, past the velvet walls into the night air that feels suddenly too sharp, too honest. But something lingers, the scent of sweat and sandalwood, the echo of a question. Who are you when the script is yours? It's a Sunday, not the peaceful kind, no cosy rain, no lazy brunch vibes. This is 1600 Sunday, which means bells ringing through cold air, pews hard as repentance, and sermons that stretch longer than some marriages. You're sitting in the back of a dark stone church, shoulders tense, pretending not to notice the courtesan a few rows ahead of you. She's wearing a cloak, hood drawn low, posture demure. But you know it's her. The perfume is a whisper, the silk hem peeking beneath her skirt's a dead giveaway. She's not here to pray, not really. She's here because the priest asked her to be. That's the truth people skip in the polite versions of history. The church came knocking too. In an age when public morality was a performative act and private vice flourished in shadow, courtesans occupied a very strange, very deliberate space. They were temptation, yes, but also confession, counsel, sometimes even comfort. And though the official stance of the church was that women like her were sinful, destructive, and destined for eternal punishment, that didn't stop more than a few men of the cloth from slipping into their beds, their letters, or their paybooks. The priest in question today, Father Antoine, is no fool. Late 40s, clever eyes, voice smooth enough to sell water to a fish. He preaches against sin in the morning, then meets the courtesan in the vestry at dusk. Not for touch, for talk, for clarity. She listens, cross-legged on the cold stone bench, while he unspools his guilt like thread. Not guilt for wanting her, guilt for not renouncing the wanting. She lights a candle and says nothing. Her silence is the confessional. Here's the twist. This wasn't rare. Courtesans and clergy shared a complicated history, frenemies bound by hypocrisy and fascination. Some priests saw courtesans as lost sheep, ripe for salvation. Others saw them as fellow sinners. Still others saw them as the only people who actually understood desire without flinching. Because what do you do when your vow demands celibacy, but your blood remembers how to burn? There's a delightful, maddening fringe fact tucked in here. In some cities, courtesans were officially barred from attending mass. So they stood outside, just close enough to hear, draped in their finery, murmuring prayers half mocking, half sincere. In Venice, one brothel built a private altar so their girls could attend service without leaving the premises. The altar was blessed by a priest, paid in wine and discretion. Father Antoine's story is murkier. He preaches about Mary Magdalene so often it's become an inside joke in the choir loft. He tells his flock to beware of women who speak sweet words with painted lips, while writing letters to one signed, "Your servant in all but name." The courtesan keeps them in a small wooden box beneath her bed, unread but never burned. Scholars argue whether the church's relationship with courtesans was purely exploitative or something stranger. Mutual dependency, maybe. The church needed sin to condemn. Courtesans needed judgment to stay valuable. If everyone suddenly embraced desire as natural, the mystery died. So both sides kept the tension alive, one sermon at a time. You watch now as the courtesan removes her hood just slightly and takes communion. Her eyes never leave the priest's. He hesitates for a breath too long. The wafer lingers at her lips. Is that devotion or defiance? After the service, they meet behind the chapel. No touches, just a conversation wrapped in layered meaning. She offers him an apple, bitten once. He takes it without speaking. A reference to Eden, maybe. Or just a snack. That's the thing about their relationship. You never know how literal it is. He confesses again. This time not to her, but to himself, out loud. "I think I love your voice more than your body," he says. She laughs, low and tired. "That's how I know you're lying." There's a story, quiet, passed like a rumour, about a bishop in Spain who funded a convent exclusively for retired courtesans, not to punish them, to protect them. It's said he visited often, disguised as a gardener bairn just to hear them sing. His letters to the Vatican were laced with theology. His private journal was filled with poetry. You return to the church the following week. This time she's not sitting in the pews, but you see her shadow past the stained glass, a silhouette in motion, a reminder. And the sermon? It's about temptation again. Of course it is. The priest's voice cracks just once when he says, "The devil does not arrive with horns, she arrives with kindness and questions." Later that night, in her small apartment, the courtesan places a small gold cross back into a drawer, next to a pearl-handled dagger and 3 sticks of sandalwood incense. She prays. You don't hear the words. Maybe no one does. Maybe they're not for God. Maybe they're for herself or the priest or some version of salvation neither of them truly believes in. Because that's the secret. For all the fire and brimstone speeches, for all the whispered sins and veiled accusations, the truth is this: both the church and the courtesan traffic in belief. One promises heaven, the other delivers something that feels like it. And some nights that's close enough. The room is dark, but not in the seductive candle-lit way you're used to by now. This darkness is heavier, more clinical, edged with metal and the faint tang of vinegar. A single oil lamp sputters in the corner, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. You're not in a salon tonight, or a boudoir, or some secret palace corridor. You're in what passes for a medical chamber, somewhere between an apothecary and a cautionary tale. And sitting on the edge of a narrow bed, her back straight, her expression unreadable, is a courtesan who knows exactly what's happening to her, and exactly why no one will talk about it. Tonight, the topic is the thing everyone feared and no one named: venereal disease, or, as it was more cryptically called then, the French pox, the Neapolitan sickness, or simply la maladie. No one agreed on where it came from. No one agreed on what caused it. But everyone agreed. When it showed up, it ruined more than just skin. She lifts the hem of her dress with clinical precision, revealing red patches along her thighs like burns that never cooled. The physician, young, well-meaning, and in way over his head, avoids her eyes as he applies a salve that smells like crushed garlic and metal. Mercury-based, of course, because that's what they used. Mercury, rubbed into open sores, sometimes taken as vapour or even swallowed. The cure was as brutal as the disease, and still she endures it. Because courtesans didn't just teach pleasure, they managed risk. They were their own doctors, their own nurses, their own last line of defence in a world that wanted their bodies but not their pain. In the 1600s, sexually transmitted infections were poorly understood and deeply stigmatised. No one had germ theory. No one used the word contagion with any real precision. And yet courtesans learned the symptoms before most physicians did, because they had to. Rashes, sores, a strange fatigue that spread through the limbs like fog, teeth loosening, a fever that refused to break. They learned when to treat, when to lie, when to vanish. One particularly chilling detail: many courtesans carried their own medical kits, small boxes lined with velvet filled with dried herbs, potions and syringes. Some included lemon wedges soaked in vinegar, used for postcoital cleansing. Others carried cloths treated with alum or camphor. All of it experimental. All of it somewhere between medicine and desperate prayer. You glance at the physician's hands, steady but tentative. He's doing his best. She watches him with the patience of someone who knows exactly how far her value drops once that she's no longer untouched. But here's the thing, she isn't afraid of the disease. She's afraid of being discarded because of it. That's the real danger, not the sores, the silence. There's a rumour about a courtesan in Antwerp who developed her own treatment regime, a blend of rose oil, crushed juniper berries and powdered shell. Did it work? No one knows, but her clients swore by her. Some claim to feel younger afterward. She eventually vanished. Some say she died. Others say she opened a clinic under a false name. Maybe she's the one who taught this woman, the one you're watching now. And it wasn't just physical. There was shame, isolation, a slow unravelling of status. Some patrons would send a servant to deliver the news. We've heard rumours, best to be discreet. Some courtesans preemptively spread tales about fainting spells or seasonal melancholy to explain their sudden withdrawal from salons. One infamous Parisian even staged her own funeral to avoid public disgrace, then re-emerged months later as her younger sister. She never broke character. Historians argue whether these women were victims or strategists in the face of illness. Some call them tragic, fallen, forgotten. Others call them innovators, women who created informal healthcare networks when no one else would treat them. The truth, as always, lives somewhere in the middle, but one fact remains. They were among the first to understand the political weight of illness. When a man got sick, it was misfortune. When a courtesan did, it was her fault. The woman before you doesn't cry, she doesn't flinch. She simply holds still until the physician finishes, then nods once, businesslike. Again tomorrow, she says, standing slowly. He tries to thank her. She cuts him off. You don't thank someone for surviving? Later that night, she opens a tin of dried lavender and scatters it across her sheets. Not for beauty, for smell. The sores itch. The scent distracts. She lights 2 candles, one for light. One, she says, for mercy. You're not sure if she means divine or medical or something more elusive. There's a diary on her desk. Small, bound in calfskin, pages marked with symbols rather than names. You glance over her shoulder and see entries that read like weather reports. Warm, aching, no new flare or red bloom returned near hip. Some pages are just drawings of skin, self-surveillance turned into ritual. And here's a heartbreaking little quirk. Some courtesans began to tattoo small dots on their thighs to track lesions. Not elaborate designs, just pinpricks of ink, a map of damage and healing. A silent language for bodies that couldn't afford to forget where they had already suffered. You leave her room feeling heavier. Not from sorrow, but from understanding. There's a particular kind of strength required to touch so many, to heal so many, and still be punished for the risk it demanded. Courtesans didn't just offer or sex, they offered proximity, presence, and sometimes that cost them everything. Outside, the streets are damp. The moon catches in the puddles like broken glass, and you realise that in the grand, glamorous myth of the courtesan, no one talks about this room, this night, this ache. But maybe they should. It's just before dawn when you find yourself standing behind a half-open door, peering into a room that smells like ink, tobacco, and recently extinguished candle wicks. You weren't invited exactly, but you weren't told not to come either. The room is dim, but your eyes adjust quickly, your curiosity sharpening your vision. There's a man seated at a desk, shirt wrinkled, hair undone, writing a letter with the kind of focus that makes you wonder whether he remembers how recently the courtesan in the next room kissed his throat and made him forget everything else. His name is not one you say lightly. A duke, a general, maybe even a prince, depending on the title he's using this week. He has coin, influence, troops at his command, and secrets he'd rather keep tucked under a silk sheet in a rented apartment than recorded in state archives. That's why he's here. That's why they're always here. You don't see her at first. She's behind a curtain, humming quietly to herself, swaying a little as she folds linens with the kind of attention most people only give to strategy or prayer. She's the courtesan who has known him for almost 3 years. Not constantly, not exclusively, but deeply. She doesn't just know what he wants. She knows when he's about to lie to himself. And tonight he's brought more than gold. He's brought fear. Something's gone wrong in his world of politics and powdered diplomacy. His hand shakes slightly as he signs his name at the bottom of the page. She says nothing, but she lights a candle, because he always talks better in low light. That's the untold truth of courtesan work. Sometimes the men brought more than desire. Sometimes they brought confession. Not the poetic kind, not the midnight murmurs of love. Real confession. The kind that could change borders, destroy marriages, or start wars. And they trusted courtesans with these secrets. Not because the women were safe, but because they were smart enough not to be surprised. There's a famous and unprovable story about a courtesan in Vienna who overheard a plan to assassinate a minor noble. She whispered a warning to the right person. The assassination failed. The noble rose in power, and she disappeared from public view and re-emerged a year later with a house, 2 staff members, and a monthly stipend from someone she never named. In Paris, a courtesan called La Clarté was rumoured to keep a ledger of every conversation she ever heard. Coded, of course. Every name swapped for an alias, every date buried under layers of metaphor. It wasn't blackmail, she claimed. It was insurance. When asked if she was afraid someone would kill her for it, she replied, "I'd be more afraid if I didn't have it." You're beginning to understand that the most valuable thing a courtesan could own wasn't her beauty or charm. It was information. The right whispered detail at the right time could make her indispensable. A lover could be replaced. A confidant, not so easily. Tonight the man in the room finishes his letter and hands it to her without looking up. She scans it, raises one eyebrow, and tears it in half. "Too sentimental," she says. "You'll look weak." He starts to protest, but she's already pulling out a fresh page. "Dictate," she says, and he does. She edits as he speaks, changing phrasing here and there, reordering ideas. When she's done, he reads it over and nods. "You've saved me again." She shrugs. "You should stop needing so much saving." This kind of influence wasn't flashy. It didn't always come with jewels or titles, but it was power. Quiet, strategic, behind-the-scenes power that moved slower but cut deeper. A courtesan could undo a man's career not by betrayal, but by absence. One night away, one refusal to pass along a message, one missed dinner, and the wrong person found out too late what he'd lost. There's something odd in the room, a small painting turned toward the wall. When she steps out to fetch wine, you peek at it. It's a miniature portrait. Him, shirtless, laughing, vulnerable in a way that makes you wince. This wasn't painted for public display. This was kept. You realise suddenly that while she may know everything about him, she also feels it. Not love necessarily, but something heavier, more dangerous. That's the paradox. Courtesans were meant to be detached, professional, in control, and yet every now and then they cared. Maybe not for the man, maybe for what he revealed, or for the way he needed them in a way no one else did. That kind of connection, one formed in trust rather than lust, was both intoxicating and corrosive. It changed them. It always did. There's a scholarly debate about how much access courtesans really had to political secrets. Some argue their influence was overstated, romanticised by later historians eager to make them seem powerful. Others point to the sheer number of noblemen whose letters were later found in private collections, full of phrases like, "Tell her I await her counsel," or "She knows my heart and my plans." If they weren't influencing events, they were at least watching them more closely than anyone else. She returns with wine, hands him a glass, and presses a kiss to his temple, not out of passion, but reassurance. He leaves soon after, shoulders straighter, mask in place once more, and she? She sits down, opens a fresh page in a blank ledger, and begins to write. Not the letter, the story behind it. You walk out under a sky just beginning to lighten. The birds haven't woken yet. The city is holding its breath. Somewhere behind you, a courtesan is cataloguing the truth of men who shape empires by day and whisper their fears to women who know exactly how to listen. And you start to wonder, in a world run by kings, who really keeps the kingdom together? There's a ledger open in front of you, thick with parchment and smudged with thumbprints, ink, and the faint stain of wine. The writing is neat, too neat, practiced. Each line maps a transaction, a name, usually a pseudonym, a date, a gift, a favour, a sum. This isn't gossip. This is accounting. Cold, clean, and unmistakably clear. You're not reading love letters, you're reading invoices. Tonight you're not drifting through candlelit salons or listening to breathless confessions. You're behind the scenes, in the ledger room, where courtesans kept records that mattered. Because for all their beauty, charm, and dangerous brilliance, they were also businesswomen. And make no mistake, being a courtesan was a business. This particular ledger belongs to a woman known simply as Verenne. You've met her before, in passing, in glimpses. She doesn't smile often, and when she does, it's never for free. She sits across from you now, her fingers stained with ink, her rings clicking softly against the wood table as she turns the pages. They think this is a love story, she says, flipping to a fresh entry. It's bookkeeping with lace. And she's right. Behind every flirtation, every whisper of silk, every carefully timed glance, there was negotiation. Service agreements, retainers, contracts, some verbal, others notarized and sealed. In the upper tiers, a courtesan might be kept on a monthly allowance, enough to pay for her apartment, her servants, her wardrobe, and of course her silence. But even those arrangements came with clauses. Gifts expected, time required, etiquette to follow. If she broke them, she could be sued. Yes, sued. One Parisian courtesan, Margot L., took her client to court when he failed to uphold the terms of their agreement. He'd promised her a townhouse and jewels in exchange for exclusive companionship. He gave her one pearl necklace, then vanished. She sued for breach of contract. The judge ruled in her favour. The verdict was sealed, but the court fees alone became legendary. It wasn't always this formal. In most cases, the business happened over wine, or between touches, or scrawled in notes delivered by servants who pretended not to read them. A courtesan had to remember everything. Who owed what, who paid late, who brought a gift and expected too much in return. Varenne kept a ranking system. 1 dot meant reliable, 2 dots generous, 3 dots dangerous but worth the risk. One entry stands out: Duke of H. 30 livres at 1 mirror, flawed. Promise of land, not in writing. Gifted me a locket, left without farewell, suspect boredom. You read it twice, it's not romantic, it's clinical, but beneath the words you sense the disappointment tucked between the silver and the silence. And then there's the math. You'd think with all the luxury, courtesans would live like queens. Some did, briefly, but many operated on tight margins. Hair powder, gowns, perfume, gloves, linens, carriage rentals, house staff, it added up fast. Not to mention fees for musicians, private tutors, dance lessons, etiquette coaches. The illusion of effortless elegance cost a fortune to maintain. A popular Paris joke from the time: what does a courtesan own at the end of her career? The answer: a closet full of gowns and a drawer full of secrets. The real answer? Debt. You ask Varenne how she learned to manage all of this. She shrugs. From the women who failed. She names 3, one who fell in love, one who trusted a politician, one who tried to retire at 32. All of them left with nothing. One ended up begging outside the opera house where she once entered through the private door. No one teaches you this, she says, tapping the ledger, unless you're smart enough to ask. There's a debate among historians over whether courtesans were truly independent or simply luxurious captives, well-fed birds in gilded cages. But this ledger says otherwise. This is autonomy in ink. This is a woman tracking her own worth line by line long before anyone else did. And still the system was fragile. One scandal could break the entire setup. A whisper that she'd aged. A jealous nobleman spreading rumours that she no longer pleased. A bishop declaring her cursed. Clients could vanish overnight. Fortunes could turn, politics could shift. Courtesans weren't just managing men, they were managing instability. Some tried to diversify, a few opened salons that doubled as gambling parlours. Others sold perfume, books, or artwork under aliases. Varenne herself invested in a shipping venture. Silks from Persia, spices from Morocco. She never saw the ships, but she saw the returns. That's why I never wore emeralds, she says, eyes narrowing. I owned the mines. She shows you a small wooden box beneath the table. Inside, receipts, tokens, IOUs. One is written in a hand so elegant it could slice paper. It promises a future marriage. He died, she says, or remarried. I forget. She doesn't sound bitter, just practical. And that's what this room is. Not sad, not cynical, just clear-eyed. Courtesans weren't daydreaming their way through satin sheets and poetry. They were making deals, tracking profits, hedging bets. They knew how to write letters that read like sonnets and invoices at once. They knew how to make a man feel like the only one, while collecting from 4 others. Before you leave, Varenne marks another entry, a viscount late payment. We'll need extra persuasion. You raise an eyebrow. She smirks. Not that kind, she says. His wife likes me, I'll send her a letter. And as you step out into the morning light, the streets already filling with bakers and gossips and liveried footmen, you realise that for all the lace and longing, a courtesan's real legacy wasn't seduction, it was structure, a business model draped in perfume, and somewhere on parchment stained with wine she wrote it all down. You step into a dressing room, the kind that hums with anticipation. The air is thick with the scent of starch, hot metal, rose water, and something deeper, sweat maybe, or nervous energy. There are no windows here, just a wall of mirrors reflecting the same image back at you a dozen times. Silk, lace, skin, and the ghosts of every woman who stood here before. A corset lies on a velvet stool like a coiled question, and standing at the centre of it all is a courtesan named Odette, holding a length of emerald green ribbon between her teeth, eyes narrowed in concentration. "Don't ever trust a woman who gets dressed too fast," she says, not looking at you. "It means she has nothing to lose." She's preparing for a visit, not from a lover. Those are easy. This is a client who matters, one who brings not just coin but power, gossip, favours that ripple like water in a still lake. She's thought through every detail of this ensemble, down to the pearl buttons sewn with silver thread and the hidden patch of rose-coloured silk on the inside of her hem. "He'll never see it," she says, "but I will know it's there." This is the paradox of the courtesan's wardrobe in the 1600s. It's armour and bait, mask and message, seduction and defiance stitched into every seam. Outfits weren't just decorative, they were communicative. Before a single word was spoken, a courtesan had already delivered her thesis statement in satin. You watch as she begins to dress, not in haste, but in ritual. Stockings first, tied with ribbons just loose enough to look like they might slip. Petticoats layered to control the shape of her hips. A corset, not one meant to restrict, but to sculpt. She winces as it tightens. "If you're comfortable," she says, "you're not doing it right." And then there's the gown. Ivory brocade with gold embroidery, fitted sleeves that end in ruffles like the edge of a storm cloud. The neckline plunges, of course, but just enough to invite, never enough to give away. The trick, Odette tells you, is to make them think they're discovering something you planted there on purpose. Historians love to speculate about how much autonomy courtesans had over their appearance. Some argue they were dressed by their patrons, walking mannequins for male fantasy. Others insist they curated their own look with ruthless precision, using fashion as their first weapon. The truth, as usual, lives in the tension between those views. Yes, patrons gave gifts, lace from Flanders, pearls from Venice, handkerchiefs embroidered with dubious poetry, but the courtesan decided when and how to wear them, and more importantly, why. Odette steps into her shoes, silk-heeled, impossibly narrow, and fastens the straps with a tiny gold buckle shaped like a serpent. "Always remind them you bite," she says with a grin. Here's a delightful oddity. Some courtesans wore false beauty marks shaped like hearts, stars, or even crescent moons. Not just on their faces, but on their shoulders, thighs, the backs of their knees. Little secrets sewn into skin. One Italian courtesan famously had a star-shaped patch sewn into her shift so that, during undressing, it would slide slowly into view just once, then vanish. She called it her constellation of no return. You notice now that Odette's mirror is framed with small charms, pressed flowers, bits of ribbon, even a tiny dried fig. Favours, she says, each one a promise kept. You don't ask what kind. Some truths aren't meant to be narrated. She moves on to accessories. A fan made of painted ivory and ostrich feathers, held not for heat but for punctuation. A string of pearls knotted between her fingers. Earrings made from jet dangling just long enough to swing when she turns her head. And gloves, elbow-length, silk-lined, with hidden slits at the palms. You raise an eyebrow. She shrugs. So I can feel the skin beneath the skin. You ask how long this whole process takes. 2 hours, if I'm being modest, she says. 4, if he's important. Then she adds, after a pause, and 5 if I'm angry and want him to wait. There's an open journal on the dressing table. You peek. It's not a diary. It's a ledger of outfits. Each entry details what she wore, to whom, what time of day, what the lighting was like, how much skin was shown, and what result it yielded. Some entries are triumphs. Others end in single-word notes like boring or unmoved. One is underlined twice. Lace chemise, candlelight behind, he cried. Clothing wasn't just aesthetic, it was experimental, strategic. Courtesans studied colour the way artists studied shadow. In Florence, blue silk was known to evoke melancholy. In Madrid, green suggested fertility and cunning. Red, of course, was never subtle. Odette once wore a red silk gown cut to resemble a poppy in bloom. The man she wore it for stuttered for 3 full minutes before remembering his name. But even the best outfit could be ruined by the wrong moment. Timing mattered. Light mattered. So did movement. Some courtesans practiced walking in a gown until they could make the fabric sigh audibly at just the right moment. Others had accidental slips rehearsed down to the second. An off-shoulder lace, a garter peeking during a bow. One woman even trained her maid to misbutton the final clasp, just enough for her décolletage to shift halfway through dinner. And don't forget disrobing. That too was an art. A courtesan never undressed. She revealed. Slowly, selectively, purposefully, and sometimes not at all. Odette once ended an evening with a man fully clothed, him begging to see more. She whispered, "Next time, if you behave." He sent her a pearl necklace and a small horse. There was no next time. She turns to you now, fully dressed, radiant, terrifying. "This," she says, "is what they think they want." She taps her chest lightly. "But this," and she points to her head, "is what they pay for." She exits, leaving behind the faint scent of violet water and the soft rustle of layered skirts. The mirror catches her reflection one last time before she vanishes down the hallway, already becoming myth. And you realise clothing was never just about covering or seducing. It was language, code, a secret script woven in thread and intention. And for a courtesan, every layer peeled away was just another page turned. You're in a quiet room now, much quieter than any of the others. The windows are closed, the air thick with lavender and something smokier. Myrrh, maybe, or the last traces of burnt cedar. The bed is made but barely touched. No gowns tossed across the floor, no smudges of lipstick on the wine glass. The candles are still burning but dim, and the courtesan who owns this room is sitting by the window with her knees pulled to her chest, staring out at nothing in particular. Her name, at least tonight, is Celeste, and she's not performing. This is what it looks like when love stops being useful. She doesn't notice you at first. Or maybe she does and just doesn't care. Her robe is loose, her hair unpinned, and her expression unreadable, somewhere between tired and undone. Not the "I stayed up too late" kind of tired. The kind of tired that sets in when you've loved someone harder than they deserved, for longer than they noticed. People love to ask, could a courtesan fall in love? As if desire and business could never cross wires, as if the heart were a ledger. But you know now, after all the salons, all the whispers, all the silk, that of course she could. And she did. They all did eventually. The trick wasn't to avoid it. The trick was surviving it when it ended. Celeste finally speaks. "He left a note," she says, not looking at you. "Not even sealed, just folded, like I was a servant." She doesn't cry, she doesn't rage, she just turns her face to the window like she's trying to forget the sound of his voice. The note sits on the desk beside her. You don't touch it. You don't need to, you already know what it says. The truth is, courtesans weren't immune to heartbreak. In fact, they were more vulnerable than most. Because they knew how to create intimacy, they also knew how easily it could be weaponized. Because they gave pleasure so easily, people forgot they might need it returned. And because they were so often chosen, they knew what it meant to be unchosen. Deliberately, cruelly, without ceremony. There's a legend, possibly true, probably not, of a courtesan in Florence who set fire to her entire wardrobe after being abandoned by a merchant she'd waited for. Silks, jewellery, even his letters. She tossed them into the canal and stood barefoot in the smoke, watching her reputation melt with the satin. The city whispered about her for weeks. Then she vanished. Some say she became a nun. Others say she became someone else entirely. You ask Celeste what she's going to do. She shrugs. "Work," she says. "What else?" And here's where it gets complicated. Love, when it came, was never clean. Sometimes it began as performance and grew into something real. Other times it started with honesty and rotted under pressure. A client becomes a friend becomes a patron becomes a promise, and then one day he forgets to look back on his way out the door. You glance at the makeup tray, untouched, the corset still hanging from the hook. It's the absence that tells you how badly it hurt. Courtesans never leave the room in disarray. They control their space the way they control their bodies, but today the control is gone. There's a single slipper on the floor. Just one. She hasn't noticed. She tells you stories in a whisper, small ones. The way he always touched the small of her back before leaving. The way he laughed once when she pretended not to recognize him in a masquerade. The way he called her little thief, even though it was he who took more than he left. And this is the part no one writes down. Not in ledgers, not in court records, not in the letters men send to their wives. The part where a courtesan sits alone and counts the cost not in coins, but in hours spent holding someone who never said thank you. The part where she realizes the performance was one-sided, that she was the only one pretending she wasn't pretending. Some historians say courtesans couldn't afford to love, others say they were uniquely equipped for it. because they knew how to survive it. But both theories miss the truth. Love wasn't part of the job, it was the risk of the job, and the ones who survived the longest weren't the most ruthless. They were the ones who knew how to mourn efficiently. Celeste gets up, slowly, wraps the robe tighter, crosses to the mirror. She stares at herself like she's trying to remember what she used to look like before. Then she ties her hair back and begins wiping off what little makeup is left on her face. It's like watching a painting erase itself. You think she's going to cry. She doesn't. Instead, she picks up the note, folds it tighter, and tucks it into the back of a drawer filled with scraps, ribbons, lace, tiny dried roses, all faded, a museum of moments that didn't last. Tomorrow, she says, I'll wear green. He hated green. And just like that, the fire returns. The eyes sharpen, the breath evens out. The woman who sat broken by the window is already gone, replaced by someone new, someone harder, someone who will still get paid, still get kissed, still get whispered to in the dark, but who from now on will keep one more lock on the door. You step into the hallway unsure of what to say, but it doesn't matter. Some grief isn't for sharing, it's for surviving. And she will. That's what courtesans do. They bury the softness, press the seams closed, and turn heartbreak into performance, again and again, until no one can tell the difference. There's a strange scent in the air tonight. Not perfume, not incense. Something sharper. Something that whispers of metal and betrayal. You're not in a chamber of pleasure now. You're in a place where secrets rot and love curdles into strategy. The bed is still warm, but the body that once filled it is gone. The sheets are twisted. The wine glass is tipped on its side, a crimson smear across the table. And on the velvet chaise, half obscured by shadow, sits a small bottle with no label. You pick it up, turn it in your hand. Whatever was in it is gone now. This is not a love story. This is a cautionary tale in satin sheets. The courtesan who lived here, her name was Séverine, was more than beautiful. She was brilliant, calculating and quiet. Too quiet, some said. The kind of woman who listened when men stopped talking, who took note of every pause, every veiled insult, every shift in tone. She made a living from softness, but her reputation was edged like a blade, and the man she loved or claimed to died last week. Not dramatically, no gasps, no curses, just a fever, they said. A sudden turn strange, though. He'd been healthy the night before, flushed from wine, and draped in her arms like a prince in a painting. By morning he was cold, pale, lips the colour of spoiled grapes. And Séverine? Gone. Not fled, just absent. Courtesans were not strangers to death, disease, childbirth, scandal, exile. These were occupational hazards. But poisoning, that was something else. That was deliberate. That was dangerous. That was a rumour too hot to put out once lit. And Séverine, for all her elegance, had enemies. Wives, rivals, clients who thought they owned her, men who wanted her gone once they'd gotten what they came for. Now everyone wants to know the same thing. Did she do it? You search the room, trying to understand who she was. The vanity is immaculate, the inkwell full, a letter half written, the lines smooth, unhurried. I forgive you, it reads, but I will not forget. It's unsigned. You flip through a book on the side table, pages marked in the margins with tiny red dots. Every mention of betrayal underlined. A copy of Ovid lies open to a passage about Medea. A lover scorned is dangerous, but was Séverine scorned, or simply finished? Courtesans, especially the clever ones, knew how to protect themselves. And sometimes protection looked like performance. Sometimes it looked like blackmail. And yes, sometimes it looked like poison. Historians remain divided. Some claim no evidence exists that courtesans ever murdered their clients. Others point to gaps in court records, the sudden deaths of wealthy men in the company of untraceable women, the whispered legends of powders and tinctures passed from hand to hand behind perfumers' shops. There's a recorded case from Naples, 1623, where a nobleman collapsed in his carriage after leaving a courtesan's home. His widow insisted foul play. The woman in question, never found. Only a locket was left behind. Inside, a tiny dried petal, later identified as foxglove. It was enough for suspicion, not for conviction. Back in Séverine's room, you notice something odd. A small carving knife, polished and clean. Too clean, as if scrubbed in haste. Next to it, a piece of ribbon, cut, not frayed. and tucked inside the drawer beneath it, a stack of letters tied with string, each one marked with a single date, each addressed to the same name, a duke, the man now buried under marble. You wonder if he ever read them. Severine's story isn't about rage, it's about control. For women who were constantly acted upon, desired, judged, owned, control was everything. And sometimes, when love failed, control was all that remained. She knew that, and maybe he knew it too. Maybe he liked the danger. Maybe that was the point. Here's a fringe fact. In several courts, powerful men kept death clauses in their wills forbidding any gifts or property from going to courtesans. But that didn't stop some women. One famous courtesan had her patron write her name into a piece of sheet music he composed, knowing it would be published after his death. She couldn't claim the money, but she claimed immortality. Maybe that's what Severine wanted. Not revenge, not fortune, just legacy. You glance at the wardrobe, it's empty. No dresses, no shoes, no trace of a woman who once ruled the room. Just a lingering scent, clove and citrus, and a single pin left on the floor. You pick it up. The head is shaped like a teardrop, and no one knows where she went. Some say she fled to Vienna. Others claim she boarded a ship to the east, travelling under a false name, accompanied by a maid who never spoke. A few say she's still in the city, hidden in plain sight, attending masquerades under silk masks, listening for the next man foolish enough to underestimate her. What's clear is this. Severine understood her value, and she knew when it was time to disappear. As you leave the apartment, you look back one last time. The wine glass still glints in the moonlight. The note flutters in the draft like a heartbeat. And the silence? It's not mourning, it's victory. Because in a world that loved to devour courtesans and forget their names, she left behind a story no one would dare stop telling. And that maybe was the point. The wind off the lagoon tonight smells like salt, smoke, something faintly floral. Maybe orange blossom, or maybe just the kind of nostalgia that clings to stories people don't want to let go. You're walking through the outer quarters of Venice now, far from the bustling canals and the echo of music spilling from open salons. This part of the city is quieter, older, and just slightly forgotten. A stray cat watches you from a balcony. Laundry flaps like white flags of surrender in the breeze. Somewhere above you, a woman sings, not well but sincerely. You're not here to meet someone new, you're here to find someone who vanished. The courtesan you're looking for, her name was Mirella, once dazzled the entire city. Her voice could bend a room into silence. Her letters were collected, copied, even faked. Dukes followed her scent through corridors like hounds. She had, for a brief and shining window of years, everything. Then, like a flame pulled underwater, she vanished. Not scandal, not disgrace, just silence. And that silence was loud. Retirement in this line of work wasn't a luxury most courtesans could count on. Some faded gradually, sliding into minor roles in second-rate salons, pretending not to notice that the eyes didn't linger as long as they used to. Others married, usually badly, occasionally for love, but more often for survival. A rare few cashed out at just the right moment and bought properties in their own name under fabricated identities. Those were the smart ones, the cautious ones, the ones who understood the cruel mathematics of desirability. Mirella was different. She was at her peak, still earning, still adored, and yet one morning she simply wasn't there. You climb a narrow stairwell now, its steps bowed with age. A red door opens before you knock. She stands there, older than you remember, but unmistakably herself. Her hair is streaked with silver, her mouth still sharp enough to draw blood. She doesn't smile, but she lets you in. Her apartment is sparse, book, candles, a worn velvet chair beside a window that opens to the canal. No paintings, no perfumes, just the faint scent of orange oil and ink. She pours you a cup of bitter tea and waits. You ask what happened. I grew tired, she says simply. Not of them, of myself, the sound of my own performance. She doesn't say retired, she says exited. Like a play, like a strategy, like a decision she made before the world could make it for her. She knew what happened to women who lingered, who didn't know when the curtain was supposed to fall. There's a fringe story of a courtesan in Madrid who staged her own downfall. Faked a scandal, fled the country, reappeared years later in Lisbon as a widow with a mild limp and a vast collection of antique spoons. Her former patrons never recognised her. Some scholars say she died in obscurity. Others claim she advised political figures under her new identity. Either way, she chose her ending. Morella chose hers too. She walks you through her new life slowly, without apology. She teaches music now, mostly to girls. Some daughters of noblemen who pretend not to know her name. Some orphans who listen more than they speak. I don't tell them what I was, she says, but I teach them what I learned. You ask if she misses the glamour. No, she says, then with a smirk, sometimes the wine. Her voice carries a different weight now. It no longer wraps itself in seduction. It speaks plainly, but there's power in it still, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, because it already knows it will be remembered. She doesn't need to charm ye, she was charm, and now she's whatever she wants to be. You glance around the room, no silks, no feathers, but there is one item that catches your eye. A sealed box resting on a high shelf wrapped in blue velvet. You ask what's inside, she arches an eyebrow. My past, she says, the parts I never liked. You let that sit. Some historians dismiss the final years of courtesans' lives. If they are not seducing dukes or causing scandal, they vanish from the record, as if their usefulness ended with their desirability. But Morella's existence says otherwise. She still holds influence. Quiet, yes, but undeniable. Her pupils adore her. A few wealthy men still send flowers, carefully unsigned, and her advice, when given, carries the kind of weight only earned through survival. She tells you one last story. A former client, now a very high-ranking man, came to her doorstep just 2 months ago, drunk, tearful, begging her to return. Return to what? She asked. To you? She never let him pass the threshold. There's something deeply satisfying about that. You ask if she regrets leaving. She thinks for a long time. No, she finally says, but I do miss the thrill of walking into a room and knowing it was about to change. She walks you to the door as dusk settles over the canal. The light hits her face just right, softening the years, and for a moment she looks exactly as she did in the salons, but sharper, more herself. I could have stayed, she says, more to herself than to you. I wanted to know what it felt like to be free of performance, of pleasing, of being someone's idea of perfect. You nod, you understand, and as you step into the night, down the crooked steps, past the watching cat and the scent of fading orange blossom, you realise that not all disappearances are tragedies. Some are triumphs, some are the final perfect performance. An elegant exit made not in shame or scandal, but in power. The kind of ending you choose while you still have the chance. You're back where you started now, in the room with the velvet chaise and the flickering candlelight, but it feels different somehow, heavier with everything you've carried through these nights. The fire has burned low, and outside the window the city exhales into silence. No coaches pass, no whispers carry down the alley, just stillness. You sit there, for once not as a visitor or an observer, but almost as a witness to something old and profound, something that's been waiting to be acknowledged. This is where the story ends, or maybe begins again. The final woman you meet doesn't go by a name anymore. She says she left it behind a decade ago, along with her last powdered wig and the last man who thought he owned her. She goes by La Mère now, the mother, not because she had children, but because younger courtesans come to her for lessons, for strategy, for sanctuary. She doesn't wear silk anymore, just black linen, perfectly clean, perfectly sharp, like a shadow that decided it no longer needed a light to define it. She serves you a drink, something warm, spiced, vaguely medicinal. You can't tell if it's a kindness or a test. Either way, you drink. It tastes like cinnamon and iron. La Mère doesn't smile, she just studies you. So, she says, voice low and even, what do you think you've learned? You hesitate, because now, at the end it's hard to summarise. What courtesans taught about sex in the 1600s wasn't just about pleasure. It wasn't even mostly about pleasure. It was about performance, yes, but also power. It was about survival, about wielding knowledge of the body, yours and theirs, as leverage, as currency, as a shield and sometimes a blade. It was about learning to read people before they even knew they were being read, about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to reveal and when to leave something just out of reach. La Mère nods, as if she hears all of that even though you haven't said a word. Most people think we were just paid to be beautiful, she says. We were paid to understand, to predict, to vanish when it was time. And that's what strikes you most. For all their visibility, for all the painted portraits and scandalous letters, for all the poetry written about their mouths and their sighs, courtesans were also expert vanishing acts. They existed at the edges of power, shaping it without claiming it. They trained their voices to flatter, their bodies to disarm, their eyes to see what others didn't. They were educated not in universities, but in bodies, in patterns, in risk. And they left behind no monuments, only rumours. But what they knew, oh, what they knew, matters. They taught that desire could be art, that touch could be political, that silence could be weaponized. They taught that femininity, far from being a weakness, could be crafted into a finely tuned instrument of influence. They taught that sex wasn't just physical, it was spatial, intellectual, emotional. It was layered, strategic, sometimes sacred, sometimes a transaction, sometimes both in the same breath. And yes, they taught men, young aristocrats learning their first lessons in softness, in stamina, in how to listen. Politicians learning that words whispered in bed could shape policy. Clergy learning that temptation wasn't always loud, it could be kind, discreet, inevitable. But perhaps more importantly, they taught each other. Tricks for prolonging pleasure, methods of preventing pregnancy with herbs no one else dared touch, how to spot early signs of illness, how to walk into a salon and make every eye follow, how to write letters that sounded like poetry but were really full of threats, how to leave without ever saying goodbye. And in teaching all this, they became more than objects. They became archivists of human behaviour, chroniclers of want. And now, centuries later, their knowledge echoes in places they were never allowed to enter. There's an open book on La Mare's desk. Not ancient, not precious, just a journal, leather-bound, filled with her handwriting. Lessons, names, warnings. A new courtesan could learn more in these pages than from any school. You ask if she plans to publish it. She laughs. The world wouldn't believe it, she says, and the people who need it already find their way here. You stand to leave, she doesn't follow, just nods once, sharp and final, like a benediction. Outside, the streets are wet with rain that must have started while you were inside. The night wraps itself around you like a memory, and somewhere above, you imagine her, La Mare, closing the book, snuffing out the candle and disappearing into the dark with the rest of them. But you'll remember everything. The silks and the sweat, the letters and the ledgers, the music and the mourning, the bodies dressed like ideas, and the ideas dressed like women. You'll remember that the real lessons weren't about sex at all, but about survival in a world that never expected them to last. And yet, somehow they did. Yep. So now you're lying there, maybe with the lights still low, maybe that same soft fan hum in the background, still tasting a bit of everything. Amber sweet seductions, bitter absences, silken smoke and secrets you probably weren't meant to know. That's the beauty of stories like this, isn't it? They never fully end. You carry them. They shift how you see things, what power looks like, what love costs, what silence means. Courtesans didn't just teach sex, they didn't even just live it. They translated it, made it into currency, language, weapon, art, and now that you know, it's hard to unknow. Maybe next time you hear someone say, she was just a mistress, you'll remember that hidden ledger, the scent of sandalwood on the page, the mirror with secret constellations. Maybe you'll think of the girl in green silk rewriting her heartbreak as strategy, or the retired woman who still makes powerful men weep with the flick of a single memory, or the lovers who left more than letters. They left influence still echoing behind closed doors. You made it through 30 nights of this world. That's no small thing. You wandered through scandal, sickness, theatre, ink, empire and loss, and you learned that behind every fantasy was a mind sharper than a jeweled dagger and just as dangerous. So exhale now, slowly. Let the lace settle. Let the echoes fade. No need to chase the memory. You already own it. Sleep well, friend. You survived the story. And somewhere in a room scented with old perfume and candle smoke, a courtesan tips her glass to you.